Are you tired of the same dull dessert every evening? Are you done with cakes and pies with the flat one-note flavors? Forget about it. Are you looking to be the gab of the gala at your next potluck? Try just throwing a bunch of random shit into some fruit-flavored gelatin. Carrots, cottage cheese, nuts, all those wholesome goodies and more. And don't just take my word. All you gotta do, okay, is fill your ring-shaped cake pan with your favorite brand of lime gelatin. Pull out the cans of cherries, pears, marshmallows, and cream cheese, and whatever else delights. Mix it up, you got seafoam salad. Your friends will say, forget about it. What a green color. Or perhaps the protester inside you aches to make a statement on the plate. Showcase your broad sense of tact and taste with a refreshing Watergate salad. Just combine canned pineapple, whipped topping, crushed pecans, and marshmallows in a bowl and forget about it. Let your friends wonder how well they ever knew you before. When you combine delicious fruits, creamy cheese, and whatever else you plan in your pantry with some healthful gelatin and let it sit in your coffee cake pan, you'll create a savory dish that's guaranteed to make everyone stop and say, "Hey, why hasn't anyone done this before?" Put away the a la mode and kick fatty desserts to the curb. Break the mold by embracing the mold. Not in any way paid for by the Association of Americans for the Eating of Aspic. Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
And I'm Will.
We are still going to be down a member for a little bit here in the future, but we should have all four of us together back sometime soon. This week we're going to be going over chapters 7 and 8 of Vineland. Will, do you have a summary for us?
Believe it or not, I do.
Oh, that's very exciting.
All right, so starting with chapter 7. Shortly in advance of the arrival of the Vomitones, Gino Baglione and the Paisans, we meet Ralph Wavone, his treasured estate upholstered in Mediterranean vegetation, and get some insight on his relationship to his daughter Gelsomina, the lucky bride of the occasion, and Ralph Jr., and his business. He had spared no expense in providing his baby girl the wedding she was due. With hundreds of guests drinking dozens of excellent wine options, he'd even tried to book the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra until it was clear they would not be flying back from whatever foreign land was so much more important than what should be the most exciting day of Gelsomina Wavone's life. Unconcerned as always, the uncertainty of hiring a new band still attempts to weigh on him. The Paisans finally arrive at midday, and Gino narrowly avoids being spotted as an imposter by virtue of his generally confused nature, despite his complete lack of experience with the culture of the Italian peninsula. After Two-Ton Carmine makes it clear to bring out some of the more traditional tunes, the older members of the audience, tiring of their film soundtrack focus thus far, he seizes Gino to drive the point home. In the struggle, his black slicked back hair wig is unseated, revealing him for the fraudulent Billy Barf he really was. Fortunately, after finding out that none of them are even Catholic, Carmine's wrath is easily soothed by some fast talk from Isaiah 2:4, focusing on the ungrooviness of literal overkill. With help from Ralph Sr.'s copy of the Italian Wedding Fake Book, brought so magnanimously to Billy by Gelsomina herself, the Vomitones put on a convivial enough show. Continuing his run of poor luck, though, the bride's rush to the band's van did plant some seeds of vengeance in the extended family. The front man himself is terrified until they wheel out later that evening. Prairie, meanwhile, has been fussing over her hairstyle in a powder room, exercising her long-honed practice of erasing her father's face from her own, attempting by this subtraction to reveal Fernezzi's. Seemingly from out of nowhere, from deep in her thoughts, Prairie notices the appearance of a woman in a green dress behind her. Ready for trouble, she breaks the silence. The warrior-like figure establishes her knowledge of the business card in the younger's purse, identifies herself as Dara Louise Chastain, partner of Mr. Fumimota. In only a moment, they both realize they've seen each other some way, somehow. That way is Frenzy, DL's reliable friend in the good old days, whose face apparently shone through prairies for her to see. They catch up, or rather compare notes. Bond is of rather urgent pertinence, it turns out. DL had thought he'd have given up on Frenzy by now, and Prairie had been innocent to the nature of relationship between the two. This moment of connection is interrupted when Ralph Wavone Sr. gropes DL, only to take a subsequent tumble over the deck and into the buffet. He shambles back to make his version of amends, and DL spooks him with the subject of conversation. The stakes are clearly high. She invites Prairie to join her in the mountains, to consult with Takeshi, and to take the heat off her crew. Prairie takes the offer. Before they leave, DL stuns the crowd with a crooning ballad of the love between a girl and her gun, leaving them wanting more, and they flee in her custom jet black 84 Trans Am. En route, DL unveils the destination and shares its backstory with her passenger. The mountainside cloister of the Sisterhood of Kunoichi Attentives, a new age order centered on feminist liberation via ninjutsu, had been through many forms on its way to 1984. From the first gate's guard, it's clear to Prairie that her escort is not entirely welcome here, certainly not with herself in tow. Regardless, she impresses the senior attentive with her strong will and basic culinary capacity, and gets the offer of room and board as long as she keeps the others out of the kitchen. For far too long, their lives have been run by a procession of crimes and atonements in food form, and a decent meal at this point may as well be a miracle. Quickly finding her footing as the head chef, Prairie soon has the various cook staff working together on some relatively sane dishes, like spinach casserole with cheese, and grape reduction glazed rotisserie bologna for the omnivores. Later, she learns that this is not a place for woo-woo transcendence, but for the hard work of the craft of the ninja. Invisibility is on the table. If only the novitiates take the time and care to memorize their surroundings and practice convincing their bodies to conform superficially. Impressed by Prairie's self-possession, Sister Rochelle offers her access to Frenzy's book-thick file in the Kunoichi archives, provided her dinner goes over well, and she scrubs every pot and pan herself first. She does, and it does. The archives, it turns out, have been digitized, and the pictures of her mother and DL hypnotize Prairie until she realizes the time and heads to bed. As she sleeps, we learn of the real history behind the photos. DL had been roaming, harassing biker gangs, when near Berkeley she ran into Frenzy filming the police, who were themselves attempting to break up protests. Suddenly finding herself midway between the fascists and the communists, she silently wished for Superman. DL was that hero, slinging her and the camera onto the back of her bike and speeding off into the night. They connected over the revolutionary fervor, though each had distinct motives for participation. Neither very rooted in theoretical analysis. DL prefers the kicking ass to reading, and Frenzy the rush of it all, but they can agree on their mutual alignment. We meet DL's parents, Norleen and Moody, by proxy. Moody was a military policeman, and a small man, who compensated for his individual powerlessness with force and rage, taking the stress of each day out on his wife. From a young age, DL could tell he feared her somehow, but could not understand her mother's imagined self-sacrifice. Norleen would much later explain her lack of options and the comfort she felt from her faith in Christ. Eventually, DL would forgive her. One year, when they were stationed in Japan in the peace between Korea and Vietnam, looking for someone, anyone, to teach her to fight, DL would meet Inoshiro sensei. His lecherousness was fortunately second to his duty, which was to pass along the assassin way of ninjutsu. In the following period, she stopped attending school and started wishing her father would do more than spit venom in her face, though he never would. It was enough for her to abandon their household, choosing the latent threat of one old man's lust over another's will to power. She realized one day that the rate of training was accelerated, and when questioned, Inoshiro unveiled that this was the way of the assassin, the jack-of-all-trades warrior who couldn't dedicate their whole life to battle. Not heroism, just pragmatism. In the years later, after returning to her parents' home and beyond, she began to understand the true purpose of her techniques, and to view herself in some newly autonomous way. Once returning to America, she set out seeking the sisterhood of Kunoichi attentives, having heard promising rumors. At the end of all of this conversation, DL and Prairie are still waiting for Takeshi's inevitable appearance, and the younger asks the elder how they'd met. DL does not take it well.
Okay, thank you as usual, Will. What did we think of these chapters? Who wants to give their overall impressions first?
I really like them. I think what I ultimately come out of with these chapters is, I mean, obviously with chapter 7, we're really, by the end of it, we kind of get a real firm understanding of the stakes that are at play. It's always kind of been hinted at, and I think now we finally kind of get our first real view of the seriousness of the situation that not just Prairie, but Frenesi and really everyone involved is kind of in at this point. I also think I love the scenes in chapter 7 with Billy and the vomitones and the wedding. We'll get into that. And I love DL. Like, DL might be my favorite character in the book, and her backstory is just a fascinating read. Which, obviously we'll get into that too, but yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't think necessarily there's anything in these chapters that is absolutely stand out in terms of, technical writing proficiency or anything like that. I just think they're two well done chapters that do a lot to propel the story and set the stakes for what's coming up.
A lot of character work too.
Yes.
Yeah. Will, what about you?
So when I first read this book, I think up until chapter 7, I was kind of lukewarm on it. And something about the mix of very, very aware social commentary and incredibly effective humor in that chapter really sold me on the book. And when I got to learn about basically the incredible badass that is Dara Louise, yeah, I mean, I that's when I decided that everything I'd heard about Vineland was overblown in terms of its limitations as a novel. Because I agree, it's the actual prose in these chapters is not like breathtaking. Although it is very good, it's by no means a step down from any of the others. It's just that the previous ones have had some very standout moments, and so it's just kind of everything coming together here. At this moment, you start to see the shape of what the book is gonna be, and it's really quite fun. At this moment, it's got really dark moment. Well, these chapters have really dark moments,
Yeah.
but it is kept not light, but it's kept feeling full bandwidth. Unlike some of his other works, where when he's in a mode of social critique, it can be quite depressing. He's
Yeah,
really
true.
struck the balance.
I agree with everything you guys said. That while there isn't, it is harder to probably pick like a quote out from these two chapters that would be similar to some of the writing that we've featured through what we've read out in not just this book so far, but in the books prior. But it really is just two incredibly well written chapters. Well written from a standpoint of the amount of characters that these chapters are handling on their own. How Pynchon actually weaves all of that together. Because there is something very, I don't even know if I can think of a specific word for it, but there's something very comforting in the way that these two chapters fade in and out of memory as transition between things. And the way that Pynchon accomplishes that is truly impressive. It's not something that you can basically compress down into a quote that you can read out in 3 minutes on a podcast. You'd have to read pages of material to understand kind of this effect that I'm talking about. But the ways in which the narrative shifts from the events preceding now back to 20 years ago, and then tracing lineage through family lines, and then back to the present, and then back to a different family member's point of origin, and the way that all of these things kind of intersect. If you were to really map out, like on a piece of paper, all of the different places these two chapters go from a standpoint of whose stories they're telling and how they fit together, it would be quite a complicated map. But at no point, at least to me anyway, did that feel disorienting or overwhelming. It truly feels like following along with somebody's thought process as they're thinking about like how they've ended up where they are here, you know. So that really is what stands out to me most about these two chapters. And there's also plenty of humor in the first chapter. Chapter 7 is one of the more consistently funny chapters, I think.
Oh yeah.
From start to end of anything that we've read for the show so far, which we'll get into obviously. Before we get into the fine details of everything, Cody, I guess it might be a smart idea of thinking from a standpoint of how kind of back and forth a lot of the material in these chapters are, to kind of give a basic layout of like what the situation that everyone is trapped in now at this point for the listener, if they were having a hard time parsing that out. How would you describe the situation that they're in?
I mean, you have this. So at this point, I think everybody is aware of Brock, and he's to kind of pull back from an earlier chapter. He's kind of Isaiah 2:4, like lurking in the shadows in the room that everyone's in, and this is kind of the part where I feel like at least he kind of his presence is seen finally. So, you know, with Fernessy and her past, her, you know, leaving Prairie and Zoid and going and kind of essentially going underground for reasons that become clear later. You know, Prairie's on this journey to kind of find out what happened to her. Zoid's trying to figure out. Everyone's kind of trying to find what, you know, why all of a sudden Brock is interested again in Fernessy. And DL, I go back and forth between who is ultimately kind of the center point of all of this in the story, whether it's DL or Fernessy. I think DL is more of a bridge between all of the characters, and Fernessy's kind of the balancing point of not just the characters, but the plot as well. Everything kind of, she's the center mass around which everything is kind of revolving at this point. So everyone's in their own way trying to find out what has happened that has caused Fernessy to come back up into significance, and why everyone has kind of different motives for trying to track her down and figure out where she is. Yeah,
I'd say that's pretty, and I agree with your assessment too, that it seems like DL is the uniting force for a lot of these disparate plot lines, but it really does, at the end of the day, kind of revolve around Fernessy and the things that she has been up to and is currently involved with. I guess we can speak more to the cultural critique when we get to the next chapter, because that's going to be probably more prescient there for what Will would have had to add. So getting into chapter 7, we start with where the Vomitones went off to from the Bodhidharma Pizza Company, with Prairie after they part ways with the calamity that unfolded there in the earlier chapter. And we learn that Zoid has passed Prairie the business card given to him when he was working for Kahuna Airlines. But more importantly, we're going to a very Italian wedding. And I say Italian, not in the sense of the country of Italy, but in the sense of the mob as represented in movies and TV.
This is not a Tuscany wedding by any means.
No, in maybe the late 1900s. What did we think about the whole scene set out at the wedding, and sort of the events that go on there? Because we shift away from Prairie for a little while.
I really find Ralph Wavone to be, he's not so much two-dimensional, but written as like an intentionally flattened character. Somebody who only really exists to establish relations. Not in terms of the book, but in terms of the diegetic world, the world that the book is trying to portray. That he is just a fixer, as he tells his son, we are a wholly owned subsidiary. We don't own anything. We're
Mhm.
just here to make things happen. And I think the way that that's conveyed about this character is really, really fascinating, because I'm not sure how he does it, but he does.
I think it also says a lot about him, just the way in which he's introduced, emerging from a pool in designer clothes, basically.
Yeah.
Really, really sets the tone for him as a character.
There is. I made a reference to The Sopranos before we started recording, but I feel like a lot of people in recent history have been going back through and rewatching The Sopranos and realizing how that show is kind of funny, more so than just like dark or dramatic. There is a real comedic element that runs through it, and just how ridiculous all of the people in that world are. And there's a part of me that, in my headcanon of events, David Chase just read Vineland and got to this chapter and was like, well, I need to know who those people are and what kind of life they live. And that was what led him to write The Sopranos.
Just extrapolated the whole show from
Yeah,
that.
just be like, how does that guy end up that way, where he's swimming in designer clothes and close talking business at people? It's so fascinating how much of a caricature pretty much everyone at that wedding is, especially the hitman or mob enforcer who keeps running back and forth between the band and Wavone.
Less of a hitman and more of an errand boy, really.
Yeah, but there's that one line that Pynchon throws out there that the second time he runs up, he's sweating anxiously, like he may finally get to use the skills of violence that he has, or something like that. Where it's almost like this is a mob that has had no reason to do any crime for quite a while, and this guy's just chomping at the bit to actually.
You gotta let me cook.
Exactly.
Well, and the irony of it all is that everything is described and discussed, and the characters act like they are mobsters, but they're not really.
No.
Like he runs like a normal conglomerate, as far as I can tell. There's nothing illegal happening except for the normal indiscretions of the extremely wealthy.
Well, and they're playing make believe. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. And one of the things that came to my mind about this in us talking about how this book represents like such a massive time of change, where like the old systems of being and old systems of living are dying away to make room for something else. There is another interpretation to be found here, that these guys actually were like mobsters at one time in the 60s and 70s, when that was just as big as, the hippie movement or these other countercultural movements that Pynchon is examining. Yeah. And just with the way that time has gone, they've just ended up basically being legitimate businessmen, but that's the only way that they know to be from a cultural standpoint. Yeah. And so they're just sticking to it, even as they work for these decentralized conglomerates rather than an actual criminal enterprise.
Oh yeah, and I think that's if we're gonna say there is a correct interpretation, I think that one's definitely more correct than the comedic one.
Yeah.
However, the idea of all these guys just being intentionally delusional, pretty excellent.
Yeah.
They couldn't quite allow themselves to believe that they'd become desk jockeys when, like, 20 years ago they would have been breaking some guy's head over like protection racketeering or something.
Yeah. Busting kneecaps in the Union picket line.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it just the, like, because you can, especially speaking to the wholly owned subsidiary line that Will brought up, like the way that Pynchon writes this, you can see exactly how this would look in like an organized crime or like a mob movie. Someone like pulls some guy really close, and he just goes, "One thing you have to know," Ralph confided to his namesake the day the kid turned 18 and got his Ventuanissimo party 3 years early. At the time, a sensible move, given the many talents then surfacing in the character for getting into trouble. Before you get too involved, is that we are a wholly owned subsidiary. Just, you're expecting something completely different to come out of his mouth.
Yeah.
And then he just uses that phrase. I love it. And it just sets up, I feel like that scene of him leaving the pool wearing basically designer clothes, and then that interaction really sets up the chapter for the level of insanity that you're about to watch unfold, because the bands have come in disguise,
Oh God.
as we have previously been told when they were talking with Zoid, that they had to find a way to look Italian in order to play this Italian wedding. And
boy, do they.
their disguises seem to just be deciding to dress like Frankie Valli in the Four Seasons or
Yep.
some other doo-wop group with these.
And their idea of preparing for an Italian wedding is to practice all of these. What are? I didn't look this up. I should have. Are they like Fellini scores?
Oh, that's a good question. I should have.
There was one of the songs was in a Fellini, either was in a Fellini film or it was named after some aspect of a Fellini film. I don't remember off the top of my head though.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah,
And
not,
then-
not Fellini films, but just Italian art films. It seems.
It would have been even better if they were all from like giallo horror films, which maybe they are. I'm not
Maybe,
so familiar with that genre that I can spot all of it. But if they went up there to play songs off of like, Deep Red or, Suspiria or these other films of that period, that would have also just matched like the overall sort of impression we've been given of those characters too.
Well, I think what really makes this, for me at least, like so absolutely hilarious is when you consider exactly how they're dressed. And I just want to read just the description of it real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
They had at last ascended a confusing network of winding streets, putting the last touches to their costuming and makeup, the glossy black short synthetic wigs, the snappy mint-colored matching suits of continental cut, the gold jewelry and glue-on mustaches, just before rolling to a stop at the main gate of the exclusive community of Lugares Altos, and all being ordered out of the van and subjected each to a discreet body frisk. And it kind of goes on from there. So when I'm reading this and knowing that this is a hardcore like crust punk band, this is like if Crass or the Germs showed up and like donned these like really bad 70s used car salesman outfits and just really leaned into the accents and just the absurdity of it, and it absolutely paid off. Like everyone was sold on these guys as soon as they started doing, and they're adept enough at their instruments to play these songs and to understand how a fake book works. So it's like it's doing so much with the idea of these like hardcore punk rock guys who normally are, supposedly don't know how to play their instruments, or not well at least, and know nothing of music theory and all that. But here are these like apparently very highly educated musicians who just happen to be these crust punks who also happen to be cosplayers to play bizarre Italian standards at a fake Italian wedding.
And not just Italian standards, but weird proggy, like whatever that last song is that they play, where it describes them going through different time signatures. And
it's like if King Crimson did wedding music, this is essentially what they're playing.
Yeah, for a stereotypical Italian wedding.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there might be jokes within those movie titles, because looking up just the first one, Mondo Cane, leads me to a real film from 1962. It's an Italian film about a documentary, or a supposed documentary that, quote, let's see here, let me scroll back up. These scenes are presented with little continuity, as they are intended as a kaleidoscopic display of shocking content rather than presenting a structured argument. Despite claims of genuine documentation, certain scenes are either staged or creatively manipulated to enhance this effect. So it's apparently a shocking, very violent film, which fits very much for the kind of other things we know about these people. But its title score, its like title track, is a song called More, which won a Grammy Award and earned an Oscar nomination for Best Original Song, and was covered by Frank Sinatra, Andy Williams, and Roy Orbison.
Jesus.
So it's possible that these kids had heard a cover of this Italian song by one of those three artists and then went, we could probably just perform that in Italian, and it's by Frank Sinatra, so we're dressed for the part,
Yeah.
kinda. So there might be more context to unearth with the other titles that are listed in there, um, which just goes to show how intense the research Pinchon is, as we've remarked a number of times.
Well, or what a film nut he is.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. Their costume also goes so far as to include what I interpreted as a fake Italian American accent in the scenes in which the ex-enforcer is running back and forth trying to get them to pick a better thing to play. He's speaking to members of the band, and I don't know if I just want this to be true, but something in the way that the dialogue is actually written out on the page felt like, rather than their actual voices, they were speaking in that Italian American like mob accent that everybody knows.
Well, I picked up on that too, but I think specifically because it's described as what Isaiah 2:4 detecting not only its inauthenticity, but also its potential for insult, drew the young band eponym aside for a word or two. Though Ralph Jr., who had talked Californian all his life, had only taken it for some kind of speech impediment. So I'm with you on that. Like, that keyed me into that there.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you had that in the notes as far as the Californian language, because I love the idea that they would immediately go from speaking in that, like, you know, stereotypical like Southern California accent that everybody also knows what it sounds like, to then immediately in this scene, I'll just read out the quote. Seeing that Billy Barf, enjoying a surrender to panic, had forgotten all about the quick release clips at the end of the guitar strap he was being strangled with. Isaiah came over and popped them loose for him, allowing the band leader to stagger away, trying to croak some air back into his lungs. Actually, Isaiah began, I'm a percussion person. My job is to take hard knocks and rude surprises, line them up in a row for some folks can dance to. That's all I do, really. But as a connoisseur, and from the story your face seems to tell, a recipient of some of life's hard knocks yourself, you can see the present crisis may not be worth emotional investment on the scale you contemplate, not to mention the bruises on Gino, aka Billy, his neck, which will have him wearing bandanas for weeks, with crossover implications musically and also generating with numerous old ladies' hickey suspicions you can well imagine no far from being a hard knock here. Why, it's not even a brushstroke on life's top symbol. Come on, Like, it's just, it's so insane. The idea that these teenagers would go to this length to go play a show that is almost definitely not going to give them that much money. Like, it might be a paying gig because bars don't pay well for live music, but
Nope.
It's one of the, like I've mentioned at the top of the show, one of the most consistently funny chapters or sections to a chapter in anything that we've read for the show so far. I was laughing my ass off reading through this.
I also do. I'm thinking about it now. I do love the fact that this is between. I'm just going through the episodes or the books that we've done. This is the second instance in which Pynchon has given teenage characters a lot of confidence and agency in doing what they're doing and being able to essentially fool adults. He's in Lot 49. I can't remember his name, but the guy that was essentially the hotel manager,
Miles.
Miles, thank you. Yeah, who, you know, is a teenager and is, you know, all the confidence of an adult and is able to convince his way into a lot of situations involving adults. And that's kind of essentially what's going on here.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You also specifically had in the notes, Cody, that you loved the word deuteragonist.
Deuteragonist, yeah. I forgot about that word being in here. I do love that word, and it's one that I need to start using more often, because it's like, when I came across it again, I was like, I know this word because I've read this book a couple times, and I had to like stop my memory and like really dig around. Okay, yeah, I remember what it is now, and it's just a great word. It's one of those words that sounds made up, but it's not. It's absolutely a real word.
Yeah, it sounds like something that, you know, would be in like the book of slang used by the dude in The Big Lebowski.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like with I can't remember the word now for throwing something through plate glass. How that doesn't seem like a yes, defenestration doesn't seem like it's a word, but it sure is.
It sure is.
But for anyone who doesn't know, deuteragonist is essentially like the second fiddle in the story, the person second to the antagonist. So the Donkey Kong joke here is that Mario's second fiddle in that game.
Right. Yeah, that man, what a place to find that word.
I know, right?
Does anyone have anything else they want to add on specifically the Vomitone section of Chapter 7?
Only that it's the Italian Wedding Fake Book by Deleuze and Guattari.
Thank you, yes.
It's deeply hilarious. There are layers to that joke. If you don't find that funny, I can't say go read like the Anti-Oedipus, but go learn about Deleuze and Guattari because that is a very
it adds
joke.
a lot to that joke, yeah.
Yep, I agree completely. So that takes us to one of the many very intelligent transition points in this book where he just kind of draws back the camera, so to speak, from the stage where all of this is happening, and we learn that the entire time they've been playing this show, Prairie's been sitting up at a hill, and then she is approached by somebody scanning for business cards. And this is where our introduction to DL comes from. What did we think about this particular section as it relates to the backstory that Prairie learns about, to the barely more information we get about the business card itself? What did we think about this specific area?
I mean, I think it's remarkably efficient because I cannot relate to never having known one of my parents, but I cannot imagine it is that kind of self modification in the mirror would not be a very common experience. And further along, when we get to them comparing notes, essentially, I think that they, there is a lot that needs to be communicated between the two of them, and there were a lot of ways that it could have been communicated in a very they caught each other up shorthand kind of way, but instead Pynchon goes through and describes the specific things in such a short period that it's kind of bedazzling.
Yeah, but I also like that he's really highlighting how difficult it is for DL to be able to try and like grapple with how much she really needs to put out there, just given the kind of delicate nature of everything. It's because what it really comes down to is, this is it's an adult talking to someone who's still a kid, really, about a really heavy and dark subject that's very personal for that kid as well. And you don't know this kid, so you don't know what, if any, relationship they might have had with Pernesi at that point. So it's like to really highlight the eggshells that are being walked on by DL, I think was a really, really smart choice. That if it wasn't in there, I don't think the conversation between those two would have had the emotional impact that it had.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that this section is an example of Pynchon developing some writing skills as far as talking about the importance of an antagonist without needing to really introduce you to that antagonist or have you directly spend time with them. Like, Brock Vond has not been in the narrative really, but is mentioned by these other characters, and so there's a continuously building presence around him where all of these random people know who he is. All of these random people know that if he's around at this particular time, it is a problem. But because of information that, from a narrative perspective, they either don't need to share right at that moment, or it wouldn't make sense for them to share right at that moment, we know that there's something else they know, or that we know that something is indicative of something important, but we just have to wait for it. I don't think that the younger Pynchon, looking specifically to Vineland as kind of this evolution and this growing maturity from him as a writer, would have done that in Gravity's Rainbow. And I feel like a good example of that is the fact that we're introduced to the sadistic Nazi very early in the book, and through him just being directly present there, there's really not much sort of talk about him or building up that character. He's just sort of present there on the page. So the other thing that really impressed me about this, again, looking at an evolution of writing style perspective, is just the way that he's been unfurling details little by little through different characters and different conversations, rather than just immediately showing the reader what those things may be or what may actually be going on. I think it seats the reader in a much better position to experience the narrative to the effect that Pynchon is hoping that it'll have.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is something that we've talked about since the beginning of this book. This is a great example of Pynchon's strength in writing characters, because we really didn't get that as much with the first 3 books. Not to say that there aren't good characters in those books, they're just not given the amount of characterization and depth that we have here. I mean, we're 8 chapters into the book now, and we've got so much backstory and insight on these characters. And that's just the ones that we have actually interacted with at this point. Like, you know, like you were saying, Brock is not here yet. He's here in spirit, and his presence, like the mention of him at this point, the fact that we know nothing about him actually physically as a person, as a character in this book, but the mention of his name is enough to instill that feeling in us as a reader that we should fear this person. That speaks to his skill and his growth as a writer between Gravity's Rainbow and this point. You know, for everything that was amazing about Gravity's Rainbow, all the technical craftsmanship that he showed in that book, I think, you know, going back again to what people were expecting from this, you know, it doesn't have that. It has really well done character development. And I think that's what kind of threw a lot of people off when they initially picked this book up after reading something like Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, and I mean, beyond even this chapter 7 being a good example of his development, I think there's actually, to some extent, an illustration of his development within it. We open on the Wavone estate, and we get all these details about what's going on, and we get this view of Ralph Wavone as this guy who is defined by what he wears and the business he manages. And all of that, if anybody's been listening since our Lot 49 episodes, I talked a lot about how Pynchon in his early works does characterization almost exclusively through essentially centering the perspective of characters in an indirect way. And if you read between the lines of those first 2-3 pages, you know, Gelsomina, being a daughter, didn't of course get any bottle. But did he hear her complaining? That is not, you know, the narrator. That is Ralph Wavone thinking about his family.
Yeah.
And that doesn't go away in the later part of the chapter, but what we do get is some more direct interiority. We do get description of this is Prairie doing this, and then he delves into the actual experience that she has. There is some more mediation for the sake of clarity.
I do. So I did learn, because I will say I'd never really watched Hawaii Five-0 growing up, even though my grandpa did. The lyrics that appear that go along with it while it's playing, totally made up. I forgot that was an instrumental theme song, and Pynchon made lyrics for that song.
Ta 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 ta.
I was hoping. That's all. I was hoping that was the case.
Yeah.
Because seriously, I can't imagine somebody greenlighting down in the streets of Honolulu, just booking folks and being patched through. What a luau! Hawaii
I mean, it
5-0. That's
wouldn't be the
horrible.
worst television theme song.
No, but it's bad.
It's bad, but it would, yeah.
It's no Leave It
But at
to
least it's
Beaver.
intentionally bad.
True. I think most television intros are bad. I think the only two,
if they have lyrics, they're almost always bad.
Yeah, the only two that I can reliably always listen to is the Mad Men introductory song and then the Lost intro, but that's just like a single discordant note played for 10 seconds and then it's over.
As far as, and this is a stretch because it wasn't written for the show, but any of the versions of Way Down in the Hole that were on The Wire are great.
Oh, that's fair.
Well, I do think that Steve Earle's version is kind of crazy.
It's different, but I'm a big Steve Earle fan, so it fits with his style at that time.
Sure, yeah.
But it's definitely. I think that might be why they saved it for season 5.
It's crazy. It's not bad. It's just out there compared to every other one.
Yeah.
So the quote that I was thinking of comes from chapter 5, and it's from like literally the second page of chapter 5 is where it starts, where it says, "In fact, what he'd done was check in right next door to her, so that they were standing on adjacent lanais, hundreds of feet above sea level, having this adult discussion, each holding a can of beer. Fernessy in a bikini and Zoid in an old pair of baggies. Except for the lethal altitude, it could have been the year before last, back in Gordita Beach. Above them somewhere, another couple were screaming at each other, out of control. Their voices punctuating helped to calibrate Zoid and Fernessy's own, though they could share no smug look, meaning, at least we're not that bad, because they knew better." Like, that is the same thing you're talking about, Will, where it's one sentence at the end of that quotation that changes the context of just how you're viewing those characters in your head and conveys a depth of history that I think a lesser writer, from a standpoint of constraint, like adding, constraint to them to still actually deliver that emotional impact, would want to spell that out over a whole nother paragraph to explain how their relationship, degraded or was always bad. Whereas Pynchon just includes this one sentence that is coming from the mind of one of these two characters, from Zoid, and it just conveys the fact that, nope, this marriage has kind of sucked, like, ever since the wedding, and they're not any better than anyone else screaming at each other. And how that one piece of information added later changes retroactively the audience's understanding of certain things that he's meant, or that he's included before. Like, that adds so much more context to the weird impasse that Zoid and Fernessy had at the wedding, when Zoid was in his, like, very romantic sort of reverie. It said, like, can't love save everybody? And then, she has the response that she does. We learn that these are people who are not really ending. And then, of course, in these two chapters, we learn exactly why they got married in the first place. So just that way that he keeps including these one or two sentence portions of dialogue or prose that have such a massive effect on the characters with an economy of words is absolutely speaks to his evolution as a writer that's just not present in anything before this.
And it only gets better.
Yep, it sure does. Do we have anything else before we want to go into chapter 8?
I mean, we haven't talked about a girl and her gun.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
A girly with a gun.
Yeah. Yes. So after Fernessy agrees to go with DL, she goes back down to inform the Vomitones that they're leaving, and the Vomitones become very smitten with her almost immediately. And she does indeed perform a song. And I have said before on previous episodes that I am one of the 5 dentists, or the 1 in 5 dentists that don't recommend Trident Gum or Pynchon's lyrics. This is one of his songs that I do enjoy, because you can
say you have to like this one.
Yeah, you can very easily map this to like what the melody would be like, and it is quite funny.
And I just love the way that everybody's loving it, even though it doesn't make any sense as a premise for a song.
Not really.
Like, what is, like, there are some like euphemisms snuck in there, but it's basically just a pretense to make those euphemisms.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come together. It's just kind of like, hey, dick jokes.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to chapter 7?
Well, I do really appreciate the way that it seems like, puppy love or not, it does seem like Prairie and Isaiah 2:4 do care for one another. That
Yes.
is illustrated
Yeah.
quite well.
Yeah, very true. The fact that Isaiah 2:4 feels secure enough to make a joke about potentially running away with this other woman,
Yeah.
and that Prairie is not offended or annoyed by that at all, I think speaks volumes to the relationship that they probably
Yeah.
have.
They have they have a healthier relationship than a lot of adults in
Yeah.
in this story. That's for sure.
Yeah, that is for sure.
And of course, there's the fact that the Trans Am's engine has been tuned to make music,
Yes.
which is just a cool premise.
Yeah.
So that does bring us to chapter 8. Prairie goes off with DL to this. How would you describe the place that they go to, tucked away, in seemingly an impenetrable forest? What did you guys think
Well,
of the place that they went to?
The fact that it's described as being described in aggro world immediately
Yeah.
just got me pretty in a weird place. I glommed onto the Asylum Institute, and I just had to do a little bit of research on that to save everyone the deep dive that I got started on and had to force myself away from. It's pretty interesting, that place. So it was actually built over what was a native reservation of the Asylum tribe. There was a hot spring that was there, and like in the 60s, they basically developed it into this. It kind of became like an alternative philosophy, new age kind of thing over time, but they would have these guest teachers come in and give these like lectures on different topics, and you would essentially pay to like go there for a weekend and like sit in on these lectures while sleeping in sleeping bags on the ground outside. But the name, like some of the names they pulled, like just looking at the Wikipedia list, like Joan Baez, Ray Bradbury, Aldous Huxley, Albert Hoffman, Jerry Rubin. People from all different areas of the 60s and 70s and eventually the 80s. Terrence McKenna, I just saw that name. Yeah. So this just people would just come in, and it was kind of like for a long time, apparently it was just this like almost communal kind of thing. Like there were still charges to go, and they had to pay for the upkeep in the buildings and all that, their overhead. It eventually got bought out by a big conglomerate in I think it was the early 2000s. It may have been a little bit later than that. 2012, they got professional executives to run it, and then a series of things happened, and it just ended up shutting down. So it's no longer there. But it's a pretty interesting read. Like I could probably spend more time reading about it. I just happened to glom onto that one particular thing in the chapter, and yeah, that's reading a Pinch on book.
So I have a much shorter answer.
Oh.
And a much better one, I will say.
Ooh. Okay.
It's a feminist ninja cult. Which,
Yeah.
I mean, I was joking about it being better because that's really fascinating. But also, I mean, this is so many different. I'm sure that the SLN Institute is more indicative than others, but there were so many 70s and 80s New Age retreats that were essentially just impressing abuse patterns upon people who attended. And that's exactly what this is.
Well, especially to the point where, like you're saying, there's so many of these places that pop up, but they're all basically the same. There's that throwaway line in there where Prairie recognizes breathing tactics that one of them is using from working at the pizza place. So just literally the same information, but served up differently in a different environment.
The thing that really ties into the cultishness of it all, because if you're not aware of the specific implications of what they're saying, you might think, okay, this is just like a weird place where people focus on being ninjas. But the self-criticism sessions are a key part of how cults function if you go back and dig into those at all.
I mean, that's essentially what Scientology does with processing.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a very targeted, very intentional version. Self-criticism
Yeah.
as like a thing is not necessarily like evil. It's usually destructive, but it is
Well, yeah, it can easily be weaponized. Absolutely.
exactly, yeah. It's usually one of those things that starts off with the best intentions and just hurts people
Yeah.
so much that they can't tell.
Hmm.
So I have to be the bearer of bad news. For I had to find this out too, so I have to kill it for everybody else. There is no kunoichi. I
Ah,
know. So I was looking at the Penchon wiki and wanted to learn more about that, and it turns out so the wiki page for that particular section has not been updated since 2015. In 2017, they essentially historians came to the conclusion that there's no records of that, and it's actually a Japanese kant term for woman. So it's essentially kind of like jargon, and it's more of a fictional kind of concept. Which, I mean, it's still I still love it. I still like they're still awesome. It just sucks that it wasn't real. It's like the Santa situation now. The illusion is shattered.
were you also hoping that the Jesuit martial artist women were real from Mason and Dixon?
Are they not?
I hate to break it to you, Cody.
This has just been the most depressing day of my life.
So a crazy ass tiny theory time.
Oh, go for it.
I wonder if the resonant usage of assassin doesn't have something to do with the mythological nature of the idea of kunoichi. Because for anybody who's unaware, assassin derives from this very strange set of myths that came about in the medieval period. Basically, the late Islamic Golden Age had a bunch of Europeans terrified of like Muslim invaders in various forms. And one of those ways was in hypothesizing that there was this mountain full of mystics who would kidnap various people of all kinds, use incredible quantities of opium and cannabis to brainwash them, and then send them out to kill political targets, essentially. And that's where we get the word assassin. So the idea that there's this myth of female ninjas who were disguised as geishas and prostitutes it feels like it fits that like a glove to me.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, I mean that concept too is not um obscure or unknown to historical writing either. I mean, there's a story in the book of Judges in the Old Testament about a prophetess who, tricks her way into the rival king's camp that Israel is about to fight, and once she's, found her way into not just their camp but into their king's like tent, she kills him. So that concept of women specifically training to infiltrate a place to kill someone, political or otherwise, is certainly one that has some real cultural synthesis throughout history. So I would not at all be surprised if that was where Pynchon was taking it by writing out the mythos the way that he did.
And at the same time, I find it really fascinating the way that there is all of this mythologization and kind of this, from the author's perspective, the tongue-in-cheek discussion of these badasses who never existed or existed apocryphally.
Mm-hmm.
But you also get these very very realistic and very like understated scenes where the how do they describe her, the Sister Rochelle, the senior attentive, the mother superior?
Yeah, the Mother Superior.
Yeah.
She is just telling Prairie, like, yeah, I can turn invisible, but it's because I'm really patient and I just sit here and I turn my body so that it reflects the light the exact same way as the room itself would, which is, by the way, how like cuttlefish work.
Yeah.
And it's just it's one of those things that is obviously impossible, but is also like actually how anything approaching ninja training functions. There is no invisibility, there is no floating. You're essentially just practicing ways to be hidden in subtle ways.
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about, determination and being willing to sit and stare at a wall for hours.
Patience, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting contradiction that he's written into this scene.
Yeah, and I also love the fact that like the way that Mother Superior character introduces it, how she says, "Take serious attention span, look sideways." Then the question of why should you want to? So just the consideration of why is this even something that I'm engaging in is a question that to Prairie seems almost foreign, because she then goes on to talk about her experience with the Bodhidharma people. And there's a pretty great quote in here from this character, where she says, "Well, you ought to see how many gaga little twits we get up here, especially around your age group. Nothing personal. Looking for secret powers on the cheap, thinking we'll take him through the spiritual car wash, soap away all that road dirt, get him buffed up all cherry again. Come out the other end, everybody hanging around the Orange Julius next door go, wow! What's they think? Like we'll keep them awake all weekend, maybe around dawn on Sunday they'll start hallucinating, have a mental adventure so they can mistake for improvement in their life, and who knows? Or they get us mixed up with nuns or ballet." Like, just, I feel like that statement kind of sums up a lot of the town, or the time rather, of just, it was a time of just popularizing spiritual enlightenment from either religious syncretism or the kind of death of beginning of the death of like traditional Christian religion in the country being something that everyone had to be bought into. Certainly all of the history with Assailant that Cody just sort of laid out is the real life example of that, of all of these Hollywood people going there who definitely did not believe in any spiritual practices that were being done in earnest there, right? It was either just a exercise in alternative medicine, or to seem interesting for going there, or something like that. I doubt any of those people were doing it for honest reasons. And I think that gets so much to, again, the weird sea change that the 80s represents, and that we've talked about in each individual episode, of just these different concepts and ideas falling away from the past that have been dominant for so long, and giving rise to an age of possibility, but an age of possibility that is created through pretty terrifying means, I would say.
Yeah. Well, it's that was the time in American history where they were trying to, basically commodify everything. Like, how can we make X a business? Whatever it is, like there was no shame in any of it. It was disgusting, and it hasn't necessarily stopped, but that's absolutely when it began, was around that time, and that's a prime example of it, is that kind of commercialization of spirituality.
Yeah, which is exactly what the Mother Superior here is expecting from most people who come to visit.
Yeah.
Well, and beyond the actual spirituality stuff, I think we should pay attention to the fact that these are a bunch of like second wave feminists, right? That's the timeline, right?
Probably, yeah.
And I'm not an expert on the history of feminism, but
no,
yeah, I know, right? But the intense disillusionment and the like almost capitulation really does define kind of how people today look back on second wave feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that was intentional or not. I wonder if there's much to dig into there, because I think it feels like it fits her entire character, Sister Rochelle. Like they're just so tired of trying to get the basic stuff, that they're done thinking that there's actually a point to it. It's just an exercise that they engage in at this point.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't have. I can't think of anything to add to that. It's an excellent way to lay that out. Did we have any thoughts on the Sisters of Our Lady of Cucumber Patches?
Just enough of it.
I'm not gonna attempt to say that in Spanish.
If my kids were here, I could. No, I don't want to do that. They speak Spanish, but I don't.
It's Las Hermanas de Nuestra Señora de los Pepinares.
Bravo.
It's yeah, it's an amazing name.
Really?
Almost as amazing as more descriptions of food.
Yeah.
My lord, does Pynchon love to describe gross food to his reader?
And he does it so well.
Yeah, in a way that I don't think any other writer has. I feel comfortable making that broad of a generalization. Can someone break down the concept of what they're trying to do with the food that they're serving people? I found this to be a little bit confusing. If there is one aspect of these two chapters where my brain was just kind of thrown for a loop a bit.
I mean, the closest I got, I'm not sure at all. So I'm saying this all hoping, praying that Cody has a solution to this puzzle.
Oh, don't hang your jacket on my hook here.
But the way I interpret it is that, like, essentially these people have always been so bad at cooking that they developed this weird, like, system of karmic note taking and like not note taking, ledger keeping, trying to like assess who does the worst food and punishing each other all with it in order to like force each other to try to be better cooks.
Well, also having a seriousness and a dedication to trying to
Yeah.
be a good cook. That is sad. Like profoundly sad to just imagine them failing night after night.
It's and I love the term indefinite culinary penance.
Yeah.
That sums it up so well. It's a weird, I don't know. It's such a it's like I think anyone who enjoys cooking or food preparation in general, like it's their idea of hell. Like all these people who, it's almost like they found the worst of the worst, rounded them up, and they're just hoping that by repetition of an action they can get good at it eventually. Which obviously is not going to happen. And the fact that when Prairie comes in and shows them how to make stuff, like she's not making anything complicated,
No.
but the bar is set so low that anything she does is going to be better. And I'm curious whether or not like they would actually get better after, whatever brief lesson they get from her. I sincerely doubt it. I don't think that's one of those. I think cooking is one of those skills that you either have it or you don't. And there's I mean, well, I shouldn't say that. I think you can learn to cook. I think to learn to really to have a passion for it, that's where it becomes kind of a different thing. I think to be able to cook certain things in certain ways, you have to really have that passion. And if you don't, I like cooking. I don't have a passion for it, but I like it enough that I will occasionally try to do things, but I'm not going to go out of my way to try to do things.
You heard it here first, listeners. If you're having a hard time learning how to cook, Cody says give up.
Just stop. Yeah.
You're never going to do it.
Find something else to do.
Sign up for that lifetime plan with Uber Eats.
What?
Yeah. No, I don't know. I don't think
we're not sponsored by Uber Eats.
We are sponsored by Big Aspic, or rather,
sure are.
Will alone is sponsored by Big Aspic, which
no,
does
definitely
get
not.
It does get a shout out in the description of some of the disgusting food that has been prepared. Yeah, your Jell-O salads have scum on them, which
is so like the idea of that is so just disgusting. I don't think having grown up in the 80s and 90s, I ate an inordinate amount of Jell-O.
Same here.
I don't know that I've ever seen it get moldy, but maybe I never let it sit around long enough too.
The way that I interpreted that is that this has been sitting on a counter for so long, you can see a layer of dust.
That's maybe what it is. It's just like it built a shell of dust.
Yeah. Just be like, man, you really made that 11 hours ago and then didn't cover it. Or
was it turtle shell, that chocolate that hardens?
Yeah, basically.
I mean, there's no interpretation of that description that isn't actually like poison.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm also just very curious what a New England boiled dinner is. I I read that back a couple of different times, just trying to rationalize what exactly that could be.
The only thing I could think is if it's anything like a crawfish boil, like we have down here,
Yeah.
but it's not crawfish. It's like oysters and whatever else. I get, like baked beans are in there probably. I don't know.
See, that sounds good though. Maybe not the baked
It
beans.
could be.
but-
I don't like
Mhm.
oysters, but I mean, you know, it could be good for some, but I don't know. But yeah, that's such a vague term.
What I interpreted it as was as a fusion of the full English breakfast and
Okay.
the boiled pudding,
Okay.
just done in New
Mm.
England.
See, I thought for a second there you were going to say a full English that just gets boiled, like just
Well,
they drop the
just-
whole plate in there.
That
In a
was my first
bag,
thought,
like a
but
sous
yeah.
vide machine.
Because he says it with a shudder, so
Yeah.
it's not good.
Well, but also like a boiled pudding with ingredients from New England would also be terrible. If anyone's had a boiled pudding, it's not a great format for a meal. It can be good though for like dessert and stuff. That sounds incredibly bad. Imagining like again oysters, various pieces of seafood, and like Atlantic salmon and what watercress and stuff. What grows up there? Even that it sounds horrible.
Capers.
Yeah.
Capers. Yep.
Some onions.
I do also love the fact that their planned meal was dip and s'mores and this mysterious New England boiled dinner.
Hey, look,
Just- Sorry, s'mores with maple syrup.
S'mores with maple syrup, which doesn't sound that bad.
Terrible, yeah.
Doesn't sound
No.
good, but
I would try it.
I would,
Um,
yeah. Of all the things so far, I won't try the dip because it doesn't say what kind. It just says dip, and that's concerning.
It could just be a tin of chewing tobacco.
Anything that you can physically put a chip into is technically dip.
That's fair. I was gonna say shout out to the Mill Valley real estate agent for choosing dip. He's serving girl dinner in an age before that was a concept. So really he's a culinary
pioneer.
Nostradamus.
and there's no chips. To be fair,
No.
it's just gonna be spoons of sour
Yeah.
cream mixed with mayonnaise.
Well,
Just-
considering what they have on hand, is Velveeta, Cheese Whiz,
Mhm. Maybe some
what else?
salsa. Maybe he was
Maybe
making
some-
like a queso.
Casey, a real bad case.
Processed
man.
cheese product based queso. Speaking of which, we should probably get on to the wonderful recipes that she does prepare.
Yeah, does someone want to read those out?
The secret to spinach casserole was the UBI, or
Mm.
universal binding ingredient, cream of mushroom soup, whose presence in rows of giant cans there in the Ninjet storerooms came as no surprise. Deep in the refrigerators were also to be scavenged many kinds of pieces of cheese, not to mention cases full of the more traditional Velveeta and Cheese Whiz. Nor was spinach a problem, with countless blocks of it occupying their own wing of the freezer. So next day, the classic recipe was the vegetarian entree du jour at supper. For the meat eaters, a number of giant bolognas were set to roasting whole on spits, to be turned and attentively basted with a great jelly glaze by once quarrelsome kitchen staff, while others made croutons from old bread, bustling about while the spinach thawed, singing along with the radio, which someone had mercifully retuned to a rock and roll station.
I love that Velveeta is a more traditional cheese.
And Cheese Whiz.
And yeah, Velveeta and Cheese Whiz are more
Standard
traditional cheeses.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also love that the spinach is frozen in blocks in the freezer. Spinach is already a green that has a lot of water content in it. I can't imagine if you were to cook spinach that had been frozen for that long, the amount of water you just end up with hand. Like that would be crazy.
I think it might just be referencing the frozen. There are prepackaged blocks of frozen spinach. At least there are down here.
Really?
That are like brick shaped. Yeah, absolutely. I used to do them as a kid all the time. You just throw it. You don't even have to really add, but like maybe a quarter cup of water. I think you just throw it in a pot and let it go.
Weird. I've never seen those before.
Yeah, that was like my childhood. Was blocks of spinach in the freezer. They did them. We have them with like broccoli too, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I also have to say that I am very curious how a bologna cooked like shawarma would end up tasting. I'm really not interested in the grape jelly glaze, so to speak, but
Honestly, like the more I think about that, it could balance the sweetness of that grape jelly could kind of balance the salty of the meat, because bologna is a very salty meat. So
it is. See, if it was
that
like
really could work.
But there's no acidity in Concord grapes.
that's
It would
that's
be
the thing,
really
right?
Yeah, that's
heavy.
true.
Like there
That's
have been
true.
dishes made with like duck, for example, that like use orange or even blueberry as like a contrasting like sauce or flavor note. I don't think canned grape jelly is going to quite bring out the same subtle notes as a freshly prepared, orange compote or, reduction of some kind might. I think if this was a binging with Babish episode, to make a reference to him, um, I think that he could prepare something akin to grape jelly that would
I
do the same thing that
Yeah.
you're thinking of. But
Yeah, that's true.
Boysenberry would be great.
say boysenberry,
I said boysenberry. That would be excellent, I think.
yeah, I could see that working.
Now, I think it's very important that we sit here and figure out exactly why UBI gets its own acronym.
Well, according to the pension wiki, it has to do with Philip K. Dick. I don't know enough
Does
about
it?
Dick's work, but yeah. Let me pull it up real quick.
Because obviously UBI has a different connotation in
UBI's
2023.
pensions hat tip to Philip K. Dick, author of the novel Ubik. Ubik is the name of successfully different household products, each advertised to solve a different everyday problem, and is used by the protagonist to stop the deterioration of the universe. It goes on a little bit from there, but yeah, that's what they're saying on there.
So they're trying to say that it's a reference to Ubik. Just what he just took the K off.
I guess, or maybe it has to do more with the I don't know. I haven't read the book, so I can't really speak to it. I'm just basing off what they are going on here.
Yeah, I've read Ubik, but I can't think of anywhere
connect
where it
that.
was abbreviated to just UBI.
It seemed like a stretch to me. Just
Yeah.
not even knowing anything about the book like that. Yeah, just dropping a letter off doesn't necessarily make it a reference. That seems like grasping at straws. But
You see, I think it's quite clearly, like obviously and undeniably,
Mm-hmm.
he is conflating the ideas of cream of mushroom soup and ultraviolet blood irradiation to make a point about how the foods that we eat are poisoning us from the inside. Obviously.
so he was calling out ultra processed foods before it was hip.
I think he's been calling out ultra processed foods for this whole book, really.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm pretty sure that it is just a funny acronym.
Yeah, I think so too.
And, yeah. But
Similar
I've sat
to
here-
LED.
Yeah, well, I think there's more to LED.
There's
honestly.
yeah. There's
Because like
No, it's just a funny little
there's-
acronym.
a little more depth to plumb in LED.
like literally, this is the complete list of acronyms that I've been able to compile that UBI stands for, and of course the fire truck,
Universal basic income.
Mm-hmm.
universal basic income, usage-based insurance, Universidad de Beira Interior, Universidad de Beira Interior, unconditional basic income, United Bank of India, United Barcode Industries, unrelated business income, unidentified or unified business identifier, United Bicycle Institute.
Ooh.
That's the one. It's got to be that.
It's the United Bicycle Institute.
United Business Institutes, ultraviolet blood irradiation, unexplained beer injury, which I'm sure just came out of people switching around IBU, and useless bits of information.
That last one could almost track.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that's a real acronym. It's
No, I
literally
don't think
only
so.
in one place.
I mean, the other thing too is he also is just being honest, and that a lot of casseroles use cream of
It
mushroom
is,
soup
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's the
to
core of
combine
pretty
its
much
ingredient.
any
Yeah.
casserole. Yeah.
So it could honestly just be Pinchon being like, it might as well be universal as an ingredient in these things.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's all it is. It's
Yeah.
just a funny way to put that.
Yeah, so it's exactly like the LED.
Enough said.
That brings us to the conversation between DL and Prairie more properly, and also Prairie's investigation into the file on the computer. You have a note in here, Cody, about ghosts in the computer and capturing time in a photograph, which is a concept that's expounded upon in Against the Day. Obviously, I haven't read Against the Day, so if you want to kind of flesh out what you were getting at there.
Yeah. So the ghost in the computer part is just my little reminder to myself that I really loved the way that scene was described. The writing, the prose there was just absolutely beautiful. But I feel like with Mason and Dixon in this book, we've gone so much into Against the Day. By the time we get to Against the Day, we'll have almost said everything. That's not possible. There's so much cool stuff that happens in that book. But this concept of photographs or film being able to sort of freeze time is huge in Against the Day. It's a major part of what is driving the Chums of Chance throughout that book, and there's I think Will might remember that there's a specific scene in that story that happens that involves a photograph and the movement of time through it. It's really cool. But yeah, it's again, I come across these sections that have these through lines to his other work, and it just, I think ultimately I'm going to have to do the chronological reading to try and, I feel like there's got to be a benefit to doing that. And I think that all these through lines that I'm catching in here are just pushing me more and more towards wanting to do that. As much of a challenge as it'll be, I think it'll be worthwhile.
Yeah, ever since I, well, I'm sure it's not an original thought, but ever since I posited that idea on the podcast when we were going through Mason and Dixon and kind of wrapping it up, I have been curious to do that as well, just to see how that might adjust the way that Pynchon kind of lays out his alternate history of the world, so to speak.
No, I've seen some people on the subreddit that have talked about. I think a few people have mentioned having done it, but a lot of people are kind of put off by the fact that you're starting with the big three, which, yeah, it's kind of daunting to go through what ultimately is probably like 3,000 pages of story. But I think just watching the development of this, as Kate mentioned, this kind of alternate history, I think that a lot of the groundwork that gets laid in Mason and Dixon is essentially the through line through the rest of the story, the development of technology and the interaction of people with the environment and all that. It kind of builds and builds throughout each of those stories, and kind of builds off each of those into their own little areas of sub study and whatnot. So I think there's something there. I don't know whether there is or not. I think that can really only be determined by you doing it as an individual. So certainly couldn't hurt to give it a shot, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the question is where you situate V. Do you internalize the interpretation that Stencil's making it all up, or do you
That's
lean
true,
into
yeah.
placing it basically between Mason and Dixon and Against the Day? Yeah. Either way, it would be interesting.
To go back to the time and the photograph thing, I think I'm fascinated by the concept that he's getting at here. I think it's something that's harder to really lock into, especially for people who have grown up with cameras being as ubiquitous as they are now. I think at the time that the story takes place and even the time that it was written, the the use of cameras was still somewhat novel. It wasn't as, we didn't carry them around in our pockets the same way we do now. So taking a photograph had a lot more impact, and it had a lot more meaning at the time. Not necessarily, maybe not more meaning, but it was a different kind of interaction with the past. It was a more tangible, like you're holding this photograph, you're looking back at this moment in time that is frozen in front of you, and your interaction with viewing it as a piece of media, but also as a memory that you have attached to it, whether or not you were present for that photograph, or if it's just something you're looking at second or third hand, or whatever the case may be. I think this is, there's throughout all of his books, we've talked about this kind of quote unquote magic. And I think photography is essentially a form of that. There is a certain magic that exists in there that we have found a way to literally freeze time and to capture it. And it's not someone creating it. It's not someone painting it and having that image be shaped by their hand and their skill and their interpretation of a moment. This is you're capturing the actual moment as it happened, and it has led to all these different things in time. So the way that this is, used as a means of transitioning that you talked about earlier, Kate, of this seamless transition from one part and time of the story into another, it's one of my favorite parts that I think of the whole book. It's definitely probably my favorite part of these two chapters.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Also, what you just said works as a perfect defense for Nickelback as a band that produced a masterpiece.
We were doing so good in this podcast never saying that band's name. I figured it would never come up.
Well, hoping to head this off, I particularly love the way that the narrator does jump between essentially Prairie's guesses at what would have been happening back then to the real history, or at least what's purported to be. I think you can probably take it as such. It's very it's a very, I don't know how to put it. It's a really good way of kind of outlining the way that we look back at the past as though it's a caricature.
Mm-hmm.
Just poignant in that way, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Do we have any thoughts on the reality behind why Zoid and Fernesi got married? Because that's a pretty big piece of information revealed through this late section of chapter 8.
I've missed it. I've missed it entirely. Where is this? Please.
I wish I should have marked off the page, but it is revealed that they got married because Fernesi got pregnant, and they were only kind of a fling, so to speak, of seemingly convenience. Like they were around each other and probably hooked up only a couple of times. Then Fernesi got pregnant, so they had to get married.
Yeah, that's how I take it, and I think that speaks to and is confirmed by Zoid's character, in that I think he thought there was a way to make it work, and he was always kind of pushing for that, and I think Fernesi probably knew it was never going to, and was essentially just resigned to the fate that she was with Zoid until she wasn't. But yeah, that would be my best guess, really.
Yeah, I think that revelation of information is a pretty huge turn of events for the character that we've spent the first couple chapters getting to know, because the depiction that Zoid has mentally of their marriage and the kind of sacredness of it, I guess is the word that I would say that he's trying to apply to it, certainly does not match what was effectively a shotgun wedding. But probably, rather than being out of obligation to the father of the bride, out of obligation to some sense of like Zoid thinking that this is the universe telling them that they're supposed to be together or whatever. I just think it's such a blink and you'll miss it moment, but it says a lot about Zoid's recollection of events. It says a lot about Zoid's mental state in general, as it has existed for, however long ago this happened now. I guess probably about, 17 years, 18 years ago. And, to the degree to which Luke on one of our earlier episodes had brought up how there are some hints that Zoid is not a mentally fit or a mentally well individual, or that he is, potentially not living in reality. This is certainly one of those things that can draw that question out of the reader.
Yeah.
But yeah, speaking of blink and miss it, I guess Will did not catch that on the read through this time.
I've read this chapter like 5 times. Absolutely blink and miss it. What the hell?
Yeah, it's literally just a sentence in there that she got pregnant and then they decided to get married.
Sure, and I mean, based on my previous reading of the whole book, that's basically what I interpreted it as, but I don't remember seeing that line.
Your interpretation was correct.
Well, I might have read it the first time.
Yeah.
Stupid, useless basic information.
Yeah.
That's also much of it.
Before we get into DL's backstory, do we have any further thoughts about this kind of first half of this section where it's Prairie going through the computer file?
Not with that particularly, but I did want to know. So, okay, the pension wiki mentions that there's a joke that was removed on page 117 in the description of the drops of ketchup and fat. I don't know what they're getting at. It's not in either of my copies of the book, and I have the Penguin paperback and I have the Minerva paperback. On here on the wiki, it's saying that there's a we suspect it might be as indicated by the concluding M dash that as Pynchon restrains himself and makes a conscious and public decision to end his detailed description of the flying drops and continue the narrative by saying "sorry, folks." But that it says in both the 1990 first edition hardcover and the 2000 vintage edition, it takes out the "sorry, folks" and it's just dash "it's the revolution, girl, can't you feel it," which is what I have in both of my copies. Do y'all have any edition where it says "sorry, folks"?
I have the first edition hardcover and it's not there.
It's not there.
Yeah,
well, it just you have the ebook, right?
Yeah, but the ebook was only released after like 2008 or something.
Yeah, so it's probably not in there. I'm curious if that actually is a thing that's in other editions of it that just got taken out.
So they're trying to say that the section that says Fernesi gestured with her burger, trailing drops of separating ketchup and fat, each drop warped by the forces of its flight into swirling micro patterns of red and beige, and dash, it's the revolution, girl, dash, can't you feel it? That there was a
where that first dash is before that, it would say "sorry, folks." That's I don't know what the purpose of that would be and
no,
why.
neither do I.
So I don't know. Yeah, if anyone has a copy of the book that has that, I would love to see that. I think that's an interesting omission to make in later editions. But I don't know. I thought that was an interesting little thing.
Unless it's like an advanced reader's copy or something. Like, I don't know what earlier edition there would be besides the one I have. I don't think it's a later printing.
Right, and that's the weird thing. If it's not in the first edition hardcover, why would it be in a later edition and then remove? I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, it reads, imagining it being here in my ebook copy, which does not include that, it seems like it would feel like a typographical error.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what.
Yeah, this is a first edition, first printing. That's weird. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Someone at the Pynchon wiki who's writing them for Vineland is drunk, coming up with allusions to Philip K. Dick and making up, inclusions in the text.
It's gone almost 10 years without an update. Maybe someone needs to get on that.
Yeah, probably true.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it being the way that the Pynchon wiki describes it, with the idea that it would essentially be a lamp shading the hyper specificity. But it doesn't, like, that moment doesn't feel out of place. It feels like there's a lot going on and Fernesi's overwhelmed and all she can focus on is these greasy ketchup spots. Like, that's not a crazy thing for somebody to focus on.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah.
Anyway, on to DL.
Speaking of weird, the criticism that Pynchon can't write women is weird because we have DL in the text, and we get exposed to her whole backstory and family history. What did we think about her character? This section of the chapter.
Like I said earlier, I think she's probably my favorite character in the book. I think that obviously her backstory is rough. Her dad was a real piece of work. And I think so that's I kind of want to touch on that real quick is that I really like that the way that her dad is characterized. It's one of those situations of a bad character being written really well, where it's obvious that he's bad, but it's not just one of those situations of like, we see, he's bad because of this, and this, and this. He is bad. Like he clearly has anger issues and he's taking it out on DL's mom, but he's also scared shitless of DL. And that's something that I really love about that characterization of him is that despite this tough guy facade that he's putting on, he knows his daughter can beat his ass. And like it I don't know. There's just something about that little detail that I just really liked the inclusion of, is that, it's really kind of tearing him down a little bit. And he's not the big tough guy that he wants to pretend to be. And, but yeah, I think his characterization being military police and everything, and his the way he treated her mom and treated her, I think definitely defines how she grew up. I think it really. I was thinking back to earlier in chapter 7 when it mentioned that she doesn't use drugs at all, and the fact that she was even drinking was kind of out of character for her. And I think a lot of that comes from this past that we learn about in chapter 8, and that she, this is just me thinking out loud here, that she would probably want to have a clear mind to be able to be aware of what's going on at all times and not be able to be taken advantage of because, she's taken something that has kind of, dulled her senses or whatever the case may be. So that plays into her just being a badass ninja and feminist and singer and everything else that she is. I love DL.
What about you, Will?
Well, right now I'm piecing together a way to phrase that I think that you can interpret that phenomenon of her father being terrified of her as sort of an inversion, even not a subversion, but a full inversion of the trope of the son growing up to beat up his abusive dad, who takes out his anger on his mother, and the dad always pushes him a little bit too far, and then he beats him half to death. And it's just kind of it's just flipping all of that. I think it's beyond the fact that it makes sense. The way that she talks about it, the way that all of the characters are handling it, is all very real in a really dark sense. And in particular, I love the line where I've just lost it somehow. Here we go. Yeah, just where Fernesi asks, "Wait a minute, you beat on your mother?" And she got that "Who the fuck are you?" stare back. That instant summarizes DL, not in a minimizing sense, but she is so much tension. She is so much rage, kept very close to the chest. And it's you read it and you get it. You understand why she'd be so angry. And it's incredible to see the contrast between her as a probably 40-something-year-old woman and her as a teenager and 20-something woman. It's a really wonderfully satisfying progression of a character, an arc, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, we've talked about it in several episodes across the course of the show, but Pynchon can certainly write well-crafted women, and this is a supreme example of one of them, where not only is she well put together, not only is her arc well fleshed out, like Will is saying, but she also is monumentally important to the actual progression of the plot as well, and just to the overall sort of narrative here. I think that it's also a section of this chapter that feels very realistic, even though she is going to see, you know, this like ninjutsu master and all of the stuff that's very obviously referential to like old kung fu films and all of that.
Mhm.
But the circumstances surrounding all of that, and especially her dad, like that is a very well rendered image of what an abusive father looks like and how he got that way. Like from a standpoint of entering into the military because it was an opportunity for him to be violent, which is a very real thing. You know, in your notes, Cody, you have it as murder as a means of recruitment. That is a very real part of a certain subsect of the population that goes into the military, and how that kind of built him out to be this sort of stereotypically, you know, to use an online phrase, toxic masculinity that then was, you know, delivered down onto his family. That is such a common story that a lot of people deal with, and for Pynchon to sort of encapsulate that in like, what is this, 10 pages or whatever, and package that as not just a backstory for this character that he's giving you, but also as sort of a mini kind of, I'll say like TV episode of watching this man also deteriorate under the circumstances of his own choosing. Like he has chosen to be this incredibly toxic person and this incredibly, you know, naive individual who puts all of his stock into like the idea that he's a badass and he's killed people and like he can, you know, be the Gary Cooper, strong, silent, you know, man, whatever. And all of that is undone by his daughter, who becomes more, you know, stronger, more deadly, we'll say, than he is. And that flies in the face of everything that he spent his entire life trying to prove to himself, to the point where he cannot eventually face his child. Like that is a micro like Greek tragedy in the middle of this one section. So even this minor character who, I mean, from a writing perspective, exists to create the backstory for this larger character, the amount of work that Pynchon is putting into that is incredible. And it's one of my favorite parts of this book, because yes, at times do all of the characters get very overwhelming? Sure. But there are also moments like this where the presence of all of these characters can lead to such an amazing, you know, movement of writing over the course of these past 10 pages or so. I love it. And I love her as a character. I think that she's an amazing character. She almost is a character that I feel like escaped from a William Gibson novel and ended up in a Pynchon novel.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned her dad's whole characterization essentially being a persona, because not only do we see that he's, you know, he's putting on this tough guy front, and then he's scared of DL, and rightly so. He also, like, right after he talks about, you know, that line of where he wants to know what he gets to shoot, and he redefines that as not what but who. He immediately, once he's actually deployed, he's scared shitless, because he's no longer in his little comfort zone where he could be in control of the situation. You know, now he's in this whole different environment. And so we're constantly seeing this, you know, he's putting on this persona as being this, you know, big, tough, macho dude. But then the moment he's put into any kind of situation where he is not in control of said situation, it's completely gone. And he's, you know, just this trembling, just scared little boy. And that's where a lot of, you know, it sucks, because that's a lot of that cycle of abusive fathers comes from, you know, being scared and that loss of control and you know, wanting to kind of dominate to kind of regain that control. And all of that, like you said, is just we learn all of that in a short amount of time, and it's so well done.
Yeah, and even the fact that it's a facade is so true to life. Those people who, invest heavily into their positions as men or their positions as like the ultimate badass or whatever, that is usually how they end up being. When Andrew Tate got put into jail, he
Oh,
became the
Jesus.
most melodramatic whiner on the internet.
Yep.
And still, after he got out of jail, is trying to say that while crying, he's not actually crying. Like it is how all of those people truly are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it when Pynchon does things like that, it lends a real sense of connection to the world and the characters that grounds some of the more. It gives him the latitude to be a bit crazier, zanier, to use a phrase that we've used before,
Mhm.
and doesn't those other elements don't take you out of it right away. I wanted to circle back to Will on your thoughts with navigating like the cultural critique and the darkness of that aspect of these chapters in the way that he does, like you had mentioned in your kind of opening statement.
Well, I do think that there is this fundamental through line of this entire kind of section of DL. I mean, I'm making it sound more dramatic than it is, but you're seeing DL start to really understand how mechanisms of power work. You're starting to see how different types of threats function against
Mm-hmm.
other people, and it's a very lucid way of digesting all of it, to the extent that it starts to break the reality of the character, because she is just too awesome. Like she is everything that she doesn't pretend to be, but everything that everyone thinks that she is the moment they lay eyes on her. Well, I think I'm going to struggle to draw the connections any better than just pointing to the fact that when she goes to her mother when she's young and insists to her, why are you staying with this man who clearly hates you? And her mother responds, "It's his job." I think that being kind of at the center of this chapter is how DL perceives all of these different forms of control. Is as like, her mother then turns the violence onto her to prove the point. I think that's the implication, at least. That these are never-ending cycles that don't ever start from anything except for the idea that you are supposed to be doing this or that.
Yeah, Cody, do you have any thoughts to expand off of that?
Nothing I can add to that. That was well said.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think the whole way that this book analyzes like social movements and progress is very interesting. Um, I think that it's possible, just to give an example of from like last week's reading, or 2 weeks ago rather's reading. I think it's possible that you could have spent an entire episode of this show talking about Prairie's opinion of like why it was her time to shine when all this stuff with Nixon was happening. Like that whole monologue
Yeah.
as it relates to her character and where she's from and kind of the way that she's navigating life at that point. It's yeah, I think that the way Pynchon handles social subversive movements and just developments in society and in history are really on display in this book more so than others in a way that is impressive and like eminently navigable for the reader. You don't have to dig too hard to understand what he's talking about or getting to as far as what these things mean.
Yeah, and one of the other highlights I'd like to point to, in terms of how directly these things can be applied to society as a whole, would be in the same line of her mother turning the spoon onto her. she comes clean and tells her parents about the dojo that she's been practicing at, and her dad just goes into this massive racist rant about how if he ever catches her with
Oh
one
God,
of those
yeah.
Asians, just
Hmm.
to not read what he says because it's pretty bad. You know, he says he gets killed and you get a Clorox douche. You understand me? It's really, I think it's very important that DL hated with all her heart to say no, but she did, because on paper, understanding that threat is not hate worthy. I mean, the bigotry is hate worthy, but the threat is also really normal. You know, if you took out the racism, it's a normal threat. The reason she hates it is because she believes it. She knows
Yeah.
it's true, and
Hmm.
every bit of it is true.
Yeah, really wishing that I didn't know men who were exactly like her father.
Yep.
I wish that was a less realistic character.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason we're also impacted by it, is we all
Yeah,
do. Everyone knows men like that.
yeah.
Everybody listening to this has met somebody like that, and if you think you haven't, you should introspect.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's everywhere. This kind of person, whether or not they are actively abusive, whether or not they are actual military police who walk around thinking that they get to kill the bad guys, we
Hmm.
all know people who take this like patriarchal code to the absolute extreme. It is real, and it has been real for as long as humans have been around, really, and that's
Yep.
utterly depressing.
Yep. And not to say that, like, Pynchon is a feminist writer or whatever. I think there are feminist aspects to a book like Crying of Lot 49, certainly. Things that I talked about when we were going through that book. So I'll point listeners back to those episodes. But I think that the other thing that he does that is very interesting with characters like that is the thing that challenges those characters the most are women who simply have agency. Like he's not doing a thing where like tough times, or bad men create strong women, right? Like you could interpret this section as that if you want it to be uncharitable. But that DL's daughter, or sorry, DL rather, is not the same type of woman as Oedipa, for example. Oedipa is not a badass who can beat up her dad and anyone else's dad and your dad too. Um, she's very timid, but she is a woman who has the agency in that book to make decisions, and that is ultimately what is threatening to a lot of the men around her that she is trying to escape from in that book, is the fact that she can choose to go a different direction. And in this book, you have this person's entire worldview, entire understanding threatened by the fact that his daughter simply chose to become stronger than him. It's an interesting concept in his books that I think I'll be curious to look for more examples of as we go along, because I think it's there. Um, and again, it's not something that is remarked upon often in criticism or writing about Pynchon, because it's much easier to make inverse complaints about how he does characterize certain other women in the books that he's written.
Yeah, and I think there's even in this book, there's a great example of the point you were just making, that he's not basically doing they've lived through this hard thing and now they are going to kill the bad men.
Mm-hmm.
the because look at Sasha. Sasha is not quite as badass as Dio, but Sasha is awesome, and Sasha
Yeah.
had like she had some people might call it a rough childhood, but it wasn't rough because her father was abusive. It was rough because like the world is tough and sometimes families go without food sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like she is almost as badass as DL. She's not as cool. She doesn't do ninja stuff, but she is intense and determined and autonomous and believable. And she doesn't have any of that background, really. She's just a normal person compared to DL.
Mm-hmm. Very
And
true.
in between, you have like Frenesi, who is, probably the most damnable character in the book, but she is also not like weak.
No.
She's just
No.
wrong sometimes.
No, she's just misguided.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she makes all of her decisions very confidently.
Yep.
And for not
Yeah.
bad reasons most of the time.
No,
Some of them,
genuinely
for
not.
sure, but
Yeah. I mean, and also, like, it isn't a surprise that she ended up that way. Like, her entire life ahead of herself was cut short by the pregnancy. And, you know, that's going to reshape the way that you go about your life. If she doesn't get pregnant, she doesn't end up married to Zoid. She doesn't end up, you know, coming across the federal involvement that led to who she ran off with. She doesn't end up in witness protection. She doesn't, like, that one situation changed everything. So, like, of course, you know, she's misguided. Like, she is effectively stuck at, you know, age 22 or whatever, right? From a standpoint of the last time that, you know, she made a choice to carry that child to term. And now she's managed to still be able to commit herself to the agency she is capable of in the situation that she's in. And that doesn't get in the way of her desire to still, you know, commit to doing everything else that someone in her position might want to do from a standpoint of being married or having children. She's an incredibly complex character and becomes that way in 2 chapters.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then you have another, you know, counter example is a crappy way to frame it. It's not how I want to. But you have Norlene in this chapter, who is framed at the beginning quite detestably. And it's because you're looking at it from the perspective of DL as a young teenager. And the way that you're walked through her learning to understand her mother, the way that you're walked through learning that, like, essentially Norlene, in her own way, was taking revenge on the man who was hurting her. Whether or not it's enough or you know, a counterforce adjacent way, however you want to talk about it, you know. But she was trying. She was doing what she believed, even though she was under his thumb.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just a lot of food for thought that I would encourage our listeners to sit on and think about, because I feel like, again, like I said when we started talking about this, I can understand some of the criticism, absolutely, especially from a younger Pinchon, but it was never so bad that it was clearly like a personality defect or like something to genuinely be concerned about when it comes to what his real life views on women might have been. And you just have to, like most things in his novels, you just have to work a bit harder to understand the full context of what he's doing and setting up for the reader. He does a tremendous amount of world building and story crafting in very few words.
Yeah.
Cody, you had a question for the group in your notes here about.
Yeah. So I think this kind of, I think, ties back to, you could really loop it back to Mason and Dixon with Zhang. But I think there's a certain spiritualism that's applied, not just in this book, but I think in general too, with martial arts, or at least certain branches of it, I think have more spiritualism involved in them. And I was just curious if you guys had an opinion on the way that that's kind of tackled in here. Is, you know, we are kind of presented with the idea of there being a lot of spiritualism built into the martial arts, specifically that DL gets into. And I'm just kind of curious how y'all come to that. You know, as far as does that tenet like kind of fit? Does it, you know, is there an inherent benefit to adding that spiritual layer to something like that?
Does anyone else here have martial arts experience, or just me?
I only do through my
limited.
son.
Yeah, I did kung fu when I was young enough to like internalize all the spiritual stuff, but to not actually have any skills.
For some reason, whenever it says kung fu specifically, my brain immediately thinks that that's not a real thing, and that it's just a thing in movies.
Well, it isn't. Like kung fu is like it's a broad set of things.
It's a catch-all, I think. Really.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's just an absurd term.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that nobody knows what wushu is. And I mean, wushu, for anybody who doesn't know, is kung fu as an art form. It is entirely centered on the spiritual aspect of those things. It is essentially like high speed tai chi.
Sounds interesting.
But I'll say I think that there is a lot of spirituality inherent to martial arts as they are seriously practiced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the defining thing there.
Yeah, and I think in this book, I think he's mostly playing with tropes.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't get the sense that Pynchon is trying to utilize the martial arts as anything other than an icon of some form of mind-body unification and a Deleuzian kind of counterculture sense regarding, like, relation to one's own body.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I did Taekwondo for a really long time. And then like later in life, I just did some like boxing, so not like a traditional martial art at all. But I did do Taekwondo for a while. I think the answer would depend upon what the end goal is or like what the direction you're going in. Because yes, I think if you're taking it very seriously, there is like a whole with Taekwondo, it's more of a philosophy, I would say, than a religion or a spiritual aspect. But those things can certainly provide a lot of guidance to your life that then creates a more holistic approach to what you're doing physically. So I think that there absolutely can be a benefit there if it's something that you're looking for. I would say Will's pretty much on the money as far as why it's present in this book. But it is certainly a thing with real life practitioners of martial arts that if they choose to be that invested in it and they choose to kind of give themselves over to that art form, then yeah, it would certainly, I think, reciprocate with an increased capacity or capability there.
Yeah, fundamental to most of the traditional martial arts, Asian as the ones we've talked about, or otherwise, almost all traditional martial arts have a very stringent focus on your mindset.
Mm-hmm.
It might not be spiritual per se, but it is as much meditation as it is like practicing how to punch.
Yeah.
Because the whole, for anybody who's not aware, that whole karate and kung fu trick of like punching through boards and stuff, it's not a matter of being strong. It's a matter of learning how to overcome your impulses to pull a punch. Because you can punch through wood. It's not that hard. It will
Especially not
break.
those boards.
Yeah. They're like 1-inch pine boards usually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You can just do it. Anybody can just do it. Get really drunk and try. You will succeed. But it's about being able to do that in a calm and sober state of mind, not acting on fear, not acting on impulse, but instead retreating to your basic understanding of yourself and the world around you rather than reacting.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's getting into
that. Some real life context.
Yeah.
Do we have any other thoughts that we want to add before we wrap up and move on to funny parts?
I think we've pretty well covered everything.
Yeah, I'd say so. So that being said, before we firmly move on, the last thing I was going to mention is, in line with the feminist theory, you had a note about this quote in here too, Cody, which I appreciate because I had bookmarked this quote. I'm just going to read out this quote from page 128, just as a final note on Pynchon's treatment of women, because this is something that I don't think most men who are writing women as objects of exploitation or somehow less than would come up with this idea. Where it says, as days and weeks passed, DL found herself entering into a system of heresies about the human body. In an interview with Agro World, there it is again, years later, she spoke of her time with Inishiro Sensei as returning to herself, reclaiming her body, which they always like to brainwash you about. Like, they know it better, trying to keep you as spaced away from it as they can. Maybe they think people are easier to control that way. The schoolroom line was, you'll never know enough about your body to take responsibility for it, so better just hand it over to those who are qualified. Doctors and lab technicians and by extensions, coaches, employers, boys with hard-ons, so forth. Alarmed, Not to mention pissed off. DL reached the radical conclusion that her body belonged to herself. That was back when she was still thinking about ninjutsu. After a few years, she didn't think so much about what she'd just keep working on every day. Finding the time and space, often at high cost, but every day of her life. Like, that description has a... I don't know if you guys have read a lot of feminist literature, both fiction and nonfiction, but that paragraph has so many hallmarks of what a lot of, like, truly feminist work, from a standpoint of the end goal of writing this piece of work is to expand the thought of feminism, or prompt the thought in a feminist direction out of the reader. It's very similar to what Pynchon is writing about, the reclamation of your body as a woman, the people who, you know, especially in the wake of, like, second and third wave feminism, the people who may try to take away your body and your autonomy over it. It is such a perfect encapsulation of the points that we were making earlier, and how he is someone who clearly has read outside literature to form that opinion, and to find a way to put it into his book in a way that synthesizes the spirituality, the martial arts, the growth of her character, and all of that. It's just such a perfect way to end off with her character and kind of preempt the ending of the chapter.
Yeah, and so thank you, first of all, for taking my favorite quote. But also, but beyond that, I think that there was one thing that I held off on protesting, because I don't think it's important to the point you were making.
Mm-hmm.
That I do think that V has a lot of scenes that do indicate a young man who has trouble with women on, like, a psychological level.
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
I think that this paragraph, in a way, is you know, maybe not an apology, but it can be read as sort of a response to his own writing in the nose job chapter, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think that it is such a good paragraph, because you're completely right. It is so tied into so many different forms of feminist thought looped together. But it does extend beyond that too, for anybody who's currently rolling their eyes and also probably thought that they don't know any horrible abusive men in their life. These things apply to men too, and the fact that this is feminist comes down to the realization that that's taken for granted to the extent that it's erased for men,
Right.
and for women it's denied outright. And this paragraph really does tie those things together in a very direct way.
I would even just say, as someone who lives in the part of the country that I live in, the sentence, the schoolroom line was, "You'll never know enough about your body to take responsibility for it, so better just hand it over to those who are qualified." That was 33 years ago, and boy, does that shit still ring true. Because I mean, and Texas just had a woman challenge the abortion ban, and they shot that down because, you know, a bunch of old white dudes know better than a woman does about how to handle her body.
Yeah. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun.
So, lightening the mood, did we have any funny parts we wanted to go over that we didn't already go over as we went through?
We kind of already touched on mine. I mean, we went over a bunch of them. Everything in chapter 7 was pretty hilarious, but specifically the line, "We're notorious here for having the worst food in the seminar providing community," might be the most, like, simultaneously 80s and Californian thing possible to say, because we kind of talked about earlier how there was that commodification of everything that started taking place around this time, but then you also had the business of making businesses of, like,
Right.
what if we took a seminar and we made that a business? But not only that, like, we need a place to have these businesses. So we'll make a whole building for these businesses.
And we can sell coffee.
Yeah, we can sell coffee, and everyone can sit on shitty plastic chairs and talk about how much money they're going to make. Like, that killed me. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, it's basically ghost kitchens, but before ghost kitchens were a thing. One of the most absurd inventions of the modern era. My funny part that I would add is what the names all of the Vomitones gave themselves, like the pseudonyms that they were going
God, yeah,
by.
meat hook.
Yeah, I wish
Yeah.
that all of those were in like one quote for me to read out, but they're
spread out pretty well.
interspersed through. Yeah, um, yeah, that made me laugh every time he dropped another one of those. In addition to as the ex mobster is strangling the guy, he then also says like, what does he say? I forgot the like specific crime, but his response is that can land you in small claims
Yeah.
court.
Yep.
In instead of like obviously that can land you sleeping with the fishes or something like that. Just it's just yeah, the whole depiction of these mobsters as ailing, no longer criminals is so funny.
They don't want to bring me back in. My favorite comedic moment. There's probably something in the DL backstory chapter. It's so dense that I can't
Mhm.
go back and look for it. But specifically, kind of in the middle of, or near the. I mean, okay, again, I'm in the ebook version, so I don't know where this is compared to everyone else. But after the Vomitones arrive, you have this moment where Billy Barf is doing his Italian accent.
Mhm.
Though Ralph Jr. had talked Californian all his life, had only taken it for some kind of speech impediment. You guys have done this before, right? He kept asking as they offloaded their instruments, amps, and digital interfaces and proceeded down to a huge airy tent at the edge of the small meadow. Just the fact that the fact that he keeps asking it. You guys have done this before, right?
You know
It's
what you're
not
doing,
your
right?
it's not your wedding. You're not paying for it. Why are you so nosy about this? They're a band. They're bringing equipment out. What do you mean you guys have done this before, right? Like, and obviously he's correct in his suspicions, but there's no reason for it at this point.
Yeah.
Just some very, very anxious, very privileged air energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you never know. It apparently took them 2 days to get to the wedding venue. Maybe some crazy stuff happened that shook
That's
the
true, yeah.
confidence.
Very possible.
Which, I mean, I feel like what everyone should do is just read that quote that it took 2 days, then go read like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and then come back and pick up where you left off. Because I feel like something insane must have happened during those 2 days, but we'll never know. Cody, do you want to take us into quotes?
Yeah. So I was gonna initially choose the that last section that we read, but I kind of figured someone else was gonna take that, so I opted not to. So in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't. I had a few that I was gonna pick from. I really loved the description of Ralph coming out of the pool in his clothes. So I almost picked that one. And I did really, really like the end of chapter 7 when it talks about Fernez or DL driving off and the kind of musicality of her car. But ultimately, I'm going with when Prairie is on the computer and searching through or starting to search through the photographs. So it's on page 114. So into it, and then on Prairie followed. A girl in a haunted mansion led room to room, sheet to sheet, by the peripheral whiteness, the earnest whisper of her mother's ghost. She already knew about how literal computers can be. Even spaces between characters mattered. She had wondered if ghosts were only literal in the same way. Could a ghost think for herself, or was she responsive totally to the needs of the still living? Needs like keystrokes entered into her world, lines of sorrow, loss, justice denied. But to be of any use, to be real, a ghost would have to be more than only that kind of elaborate pretending. There are some really knockout sections in here as far as just the general prose, and I think that's one of them. That imagery is just beautiful.
Yeah, I agree completely. Will, what about you? I am indeed making you not go
I was
last.
just about to say.
No, I'm just paged away for some reason when I just found a section. So give me a moment.
Sure thing, buddy.
Why do I do this to myself?
I don't know. Cody liked that one though.
From the mess hall next door, an ambiguous murmuring, part hunger, part apprehension, had grown in volume. Prairie grabbed a kettle of institutional tomato soup, carried it on in, and for the next couple of hours she also schlepped racks of newly washed cups and dishes in and bussed dirty dishes out, cleaned off tabletops, poured coffee, going from one set of chores to another as they arose, sensing partial vacuums and flowing there to fill them, unable to help noticing that people were talking or taking seconds on the spinach casserole, and the bologna, too. Later, she scrubbed out pots and pans and helped put stuff away and swabbed down the stone floor of the kitchen and scullery. By the time she got upstairs to the Ninjet Terminal Center and found out how to log in, the midsummer sunset had come and gone, and the sounds of an evening koto workshop mixed with the good nights of courtyard birds. And that's, there's not much depth to it, except that I think it's great whenever an author decides to take what is usually just yada yada away and makes it the centerpiece for a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another one of those transitional elements of that chapter that I really loved. My quote comes from chapter 8. In my edition, it is on page 116. And it's from the description of when Frenessy and DL met one another. What she found was Frenessy, who'd been out with her camera and a bag full of bootlegged eco stock since dawn, finally ending up on Telegraph Avenue, filming a skirmish line of paramilitary coming up the street in riot gear, carrying small and, she hoped, only firing rubber bullet-firing rifles. Last time, she'd been at the front edge of a crowd who were slowly retreating from the campus, trashing what they could as they went. When the film roll ended and she came up out of safety of her viewfinder, Frenessy was alone, halfway between the people and the police, with no side street handy to go dodging down. Shop doors were all secured with chain, windows shuttered over with heavy plywood. Her next step would have been just to go ahead and change roles, get some more footage, but to go rooting around in her bag right now could only be taken as a threat by the boys in the khaki, who'd come close enough that even above the lingering nose-wrenching ground note of tear gas, she could still begin to smell them. The aftershave, the gunmetal in the sun, the new-issue uniforms whose armpits by now are musky with fear. Oh, I need Superman, she prayed. Tarzan on that vine. The basic stone bowel flash had come and gone about the time DL showed up, all in black, including helmet and face shield, riding her esteemed and bad red and silver check motorcycle, the Che Z, over-designed in every part, up onto which she gathered Frenessy out of danger, camera, miniskirt, equipment bags and all, and carried her away. Skidding among piles of street debris and paper fires, over crumpled auto glass, trying not to hit anybody lying on the pavement, up onto some sidewalk and around the corner at last, and down the long hillside to the bay, flashing in late sun, they escaped. In a snarling dream rush of speed and scent. With her bare thighs, Frenessy gripped the leather hips of her benefactor, finding that she'd also pressed her face against the fragrant leather back. She never thought it might be a woman she hugged this way. I love that quote for a ton of reasons. One, I think the place setting for the scene as it unfolds is amazing from a standpoint of describing, like, all of the descriptive words that he uses to describe the police and, like, what the day was from a temperature and an environment perspective. And then finally, when the two of them sort of get enmeshed when DL comes in and picks her up, that description of almost potentially like oh, am I attracted to this woman? Like, awakening in Frenzy, like, right at that moment is just such descriptive prose the whole way through. Like, the way that the scene unfolds, the way that it introduces these characters to one another, and just each detail is so perfect. And I'd also just love to see what that relationship would have been like if that was indeed where it was headed. Yeah, I love that quote very much.
Yeah, it was a contender. It's pretty awesome.
That's a good one.
It really is.
All right. So what about most pinch on part of the chapter?
I'm saying naming the wedding fake book after obscure French postmodernist philosophers. That shit's like, that's such a deep cut.
Yeah, they are not popular postmodern philosophers. And Will, what about you? Most pinch on part?
I'm actually struggling to choose one.
Yeah, I did too.
I've been trying to figure it out, and I was hoping that Cody wouldn't do what he just did, so that I wouldn't have to think about it.
There's a lot of theft all over the place in this episode.
Ton of
It
theft.
really is.
It's amazing we trust each other at all.
Well, I don't know. Apparently, your kids are going to be at war with me and Brett's kids, so
Well, you can have trust despite war.
I suppose that's fair. But I know that in the future, you will be an enemy of both mine and Brett's in some respect.
Look, as long as we know where we're going. End of sentence. I might go with the UBI line. That in isolation is just incredibly Pinchonian.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, yeah, you don't need to specify that cream of mushroom soup is universal. You don't need to come up with this weird, stupid, jargony name for it. It doesn't help anything except that it's really funny.
It is.
It is indeed. I would definitely say that my most pinch on part of the chapter would be related to what Will said, in that it's the appearance of more food, just described the way that it is. That's just a very unique quirk of Pinchon's writing as a whole. I really want to know what pizza did to him, man.
Yeah.
Because between
there's a relationship there.
There's something's going on, like between the pizza and Mason and Dixon, the pizza and this, and then the pizza and Inherent Vice. Like, he's got something. Something's going on between Pinchon and pizza.
Was there pizza stuff in Bleeding Edge? I don't remember offhand if there was.
There might be.
Well,
it's in New York, so like, it's ripe for material.
Yeah.
So we did have a couple of listener questions and comments. Two of you reached out on Instagram, which was great. Cody, do you want to read the first Instagram message that Luke sent to us from Matt?
Yeah. So this is from Matt, and it says, "Hey y'all, just wanted to say how much I love and appreciate this podcast. I've been going through Pinchon's books this year and found y'all right when I was starting Mason and Dixon, which will be the last on my list. The podcast is such a great guide, and I've gotten so much more out of the book from hearing your discussions. I was desperately searching for good podcasts on Pinchon when I started reading his work, and all I could find was people talking about how much they hated it. Part of why we started this show. It's a dream come true to find a podcast where people engage with it seriously and mine it for meaning as well as y'all do. I also really enjoyed your rant about I-35. Yeah. I live in DFW, so I deal with it on a daily basis. I'm sorry, man. Keep up the great work. Happy holidays. Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate that. Yeah, this show was formed out of a lack of Pinchon podcasts that were not dunking on his work and also weren't specifically about Gravity's Rainbow and only Gravity's Rainbow, and a very surface level overview of it from any number of podcasts. And I haven't listened to all of them, but we wanted to do something that was not necessarily scholarly, but just brought something to the table to help people read these books and to kind of get something out of it. So I'm glad that you found us, and we're happy to have you as a listener, and we look forward to keeping going on with this thing.
Yeah, I don't know what other shape our podcast really could have taken place, because when me and Cody were originally talking about what it should be, this was really, what the show ended up being really was the only idea either of us had as far as how to go about doing it. And it obviously did come out of a lack of something like this being available. And honestly, to I believe I mentioned this off recording when Luke was doing his bonus episode, but the format for this podcast is really inspired by a show called Rereading Wolf. That was a show that I was listening to at the time when me and Cody were talking about potentially putting the show together. And I thought to myself, that's a great show for that author, but I think that a similar show for Pinchon would be really necessary, and really necessary for a lot more authors whose works tend to be esoteric or a bit more difficult to decipher out. So I know that we're all just excited to have an excuse to talk about Pinchon weekly.
Yeah. That's the main. That's the main thing. Is I just like having people I can talk about Pinchon with.
Yeah. So I think all of us are pretty well in this to continue providing these discussions for everyone, especially if the response continues to be what it has been.
Yeah, we are having fun. Just in case it isn't clear, this is not something we're doing for some long con. This is not something we're
Right.
doing to like feel smart about ourselves. We're all sitting around talking about one of our favorite authors because we like to dig through it and figure out what it means.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully people listening to that can kind of use this as inspiration to do their own investigating, because as much published stuff as there has been about Thomas Pynchon, there is so much more to get out of every single one of his books than is published in some literary journal. And just because you don't have experience reading literature with the big L doesn't mean you can't have fun trying to figure out what the hell he's saying in a really obscure passage. It's just fun.
Yeah, it's it's. I mean, it's. I don't think any of us are trying to, present this as any kind of hyper researched or anything like that. Like I take this stuff, I just read it and I'm getting out of it what I get out of it. I will dive into some things that I don't understand the technicality of, but at the end of the day, like I think all we're doing here is just talking about what we love about these books and what makes them work on a deeper level than just a surface level glossing. But I think the more we dive into it and the more we talk to each other about it, it opens up different avenues that we might not have seen when we were reading it, and opens up new doors for us to interpret it in different ways.
Yeah, could not have said that better myself. Will, do you want to read the second thing we got from Instagram that Luke sent us?
Sure, fine. I was getting mentally prepared to read our first 1-star review, but sure.
Oh,
I mean, if you'd rather read that, then you're more than welcome. I'll switch with you.
No, this is fine. I already have the post open.
Okay.
So the 1-star review. Did you need to have that open? Because I memorized that.
I have it tattooed.
No, the second Instagram post. From Anarcho Succubus on Instagram. Currently
Great
on my
name.
first ever reread of a Pynchon novel, thanks to Mapping This Out podcast as a reading group. Can't recommend enough. My first read, I focused on the heartbreaking narrative and beautiful prose of FBI informants and hippie radicals reckoning with their past failures and betrayals. Now in my second read, and having read most of Pynchon, I see the text more as a meta-commentary by Pynchon himself on how people wanted him to return to those hippie gravity's rainbow days, which at that point of post-Nixon and post-Reagan were impossible to return to, and what it means to evolve as an artist, writer, and radical. And I can't say you're wrong.
No.
Legally, I have a contract. But also, no, I think that both of those interpretations are as valid as, or not valid, but as important as one another when you're reading this book. I think it's really fun how much of this book is mocking critics of his own work.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big. I mean, for me at least, it's one of the biggest things about Pynchon that makes me enjoy reading his books is there is not one singular way in which it can be interpreted. I think there are people who will make the argument that there is a right or wrong interpretation of it. I don't think that's the case. I think that there's so much happening in all of these books that it opens itself up to a lot of different interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing to indicate that Thomas Pynchon ever said or desired for there to be one interpretation of the work. I firmly believe that he would be in opposition to that as a concept. Well, as Will said, we got our first 1-star review. This comes from Apple Podcasts, courtesy of username 1988 pens, or maybe 1988 pens.
Too many pens.
Or maybe 1988 pens, or 1988 pens. However your name is meant to be pronounced. The title of this review is NVM, and the text of this review is NVM. I mean, Nevermind is a perfectly good grunge album from the 1990s, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure what that does to relate to Vineland.
I have this simple request. Whoever this listener is, I don't know if
1988
this was
pens.
I don't know if this was uh a sly attempt to lower our rate. If you're from a some community that's trying to just bring us down, like
The man.
that didn't work on that level.
Capital
I
T,
have
they.
lost. Yeah, I have lost sleep because I don't understand what this means. Like, there needs to be more here. I'm not upset that you don't like the show. That's fine. Like, this obviously, like, we are not going to appeal to everybody, but I just want more, please. Like, I don't know. Like, never mind what. Like, never mind us as a like. I don't know. I don't know. If you could like expound on what it is, that would be cool. I guess.
We're just that superfluous, really. That's what I
Maybe.
interpret it as.
Yeah,
I have to
maybe.
appreciate the brevity of it at least.
Yeah, this person, they say what they mean and then they move
They
on.
didn't have time to write out a whole. Yeah. There's no time for that.
The definition of loquacious should be the opposite of 1988 pens. So that is all of the communication we've gotten from you guys. Please, if you have any desire to write into the show, our email is always in the show description. But if for some reason you don't have access to that, our email address is mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. I think it's been a couple of weeks since we actually verbally said that.
Probably has, yeah.
Our Twitter is pinchonpod. If you go to x.com
No.
and put in pinchonpod, that you'll find us there. And we are on Instagram as well at Mapping the Zone Podcast. We've all really loved getting to hear from a few more of our listeners this sort of, I don't know, what do we want to call this, season or book reading or
This book.
Yeah, this time through, it's been nice to have the additional input from our listeners. So please keep it coming. Doesn't have to be direct questions, although we love those. Anything.
It'd just be 3 letters.
Yeah, you could take after 1988 pens.
I do want to add before we go.
Yes,
we had some pretty cool news. Brett Beeble, our friend who helped us through Mason and Dixon. As we mentioned when we were doing those episodes, has a companion book coming out for Mason and Dixon, and the pre-orders are finally up for that. So I will put a link to the pre-order website in the show notes. I don't know if it is still happening, but hold on. Before I say anything, I may need to edit myself out. You have until tomorrow, if you're listening to this the day this comes out. December 16th is the cutoff. There is a code to get 50% off the book. I will include that in the show notes as well, but it is 08 Falls L FALLSL. 50% off. It's a good deal. I already ordered my copy. I'm really looking forward to it. It comes out in June. So please support Brett and his book. Brett was supremely helpful for us and is just a great person. We had a great time talking to him. And we wish him all the best and the best of luck with his book.
Did you pre-order the hardcover or the
No,
paperback?
Paperback.
But it's 50% off, Cody.
I know, but
You can't
I had to go
afford not
paperback.
to take those savings.
Exactly.
Yeah. Most of my books are paperback, so I try to stick with that.
Yeah, it's
But
fair.
just think what the first edition hardcover copy of A Mason and Dixon Companion will be worth
true.
in 70 years.
That's
Published
true.
by the University of Georgia Press.
I'd have to get it
Sorry, good
autographed.
publisher.
I feel like that's doable.
Yeah, it's true. Anyways, yeah, go buy it. Brett's great, and
Brett
we
is great. We love
are
you,
very
Brett.
fond of him. Thank you, Brett.
Next week, we will be back with a discussion on just Chapter 9. So if you're reading along with us, just read Chapter 9. Don't read 9 and 10. It's a long chapter. That is why it gets its own episode. And As always, thank you so much for listening. My name is Kate.
My name is Cody.
And I am Will.
And we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye.
Bye.
Never mind.
That also took me back because my mom used to have a Trans Am back in the day.
The only
Which is
story I have
weird.
like that is my mom was picked up to go to prom in a Trans Am.
Oh, see, when my parents were in high school, my dad had a 71 Cuda, whatever the car Nash Bridges drove was. That's what he had. So much louder than a Trans Am. But the fact that my mom who grew up in high school as a John Denver loving hippie, essentially, had a Trans Am when I was in elementary school, still blows my mind.
Hey, the love of that Phoenix, that doesn't miss anybody.
Yeah.
You still see them all over the place in Albuquerque.
Oh, they're all over San Antonio.
It's
really
great.
Yeah.
Low humidity over here, and then I guess they just drive them over to Texas.
Do you know why it's such a big deal over there?
I don't know why it is here. It might have to do with street racing. But I don't know. I don't know enough about cars to really know that.
Fair.
I have no clue. I think they're just like an incredibly well designed from an aesthetic perspective car.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, you can't think of any that are much more iconic.
If we have any gearheads in the audience who know the answer to this, like why those cars are so popular still, I would really genuinely like to know.
Well, specifically in Phoenix and in Texas, apparently.
Well, so in the Southwest, it's because there's no humidity here, and so there are classic cars all over the place. Nothing dies here.
Yeah,
Cars
you don't have to worry
run
about it.
in
Yeah.
San Antonio, it's a mystery.
A lot of things in San Antonio are a mystery, but that's another podcast.
Yep, very much so.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, like I've known people who had zero like cooking lessons at any point in their life, and so it's like watching them struggle to like make food when they try to make. Like I lived with a guy who did this, and it was always fascinating to try to like watch him make stuff or attempt to make stuff, and he refused to help. Like he had this level of pride of like I can figure it out, and I was always like, dude, get a cookbook, like watch something online. Like I don't like there are ways to learn how to do this, but he was so steadfast in doing it that he just like it always became just a mess, and he would get frustrated, just go back into his room. So it's I don't know. I've seen people make weird things. I've seen people do weird mistakes cooking that you shouldn't really think would happen, but they do. Way of the world.
I will say, I think that there's a case to be made that my father was suffering from some kind of indefinite culinary penance, because he had this concept in his head that he would make the best eggs he would ever make in his life if he separated the egg whites from the egg yolks and then beat the egg whites into like a loose meringue, basically, right? And then folding that back in with the egg yolks and then cooking all of that together. He had this like vision for either an omelet or just making the eggs that it would make them really fluffy and nice, and like I can understand the logic he was applying, right? He never had the dedication to beat the egg whites into an actual like nearing a meringue consistency.
Oh, did it just get to that foam level?
Yeah, all he would do is use a whisk until it reached that foam level, and then he would fold that into his egg yolks and then try and cook it that way, and then he would get unreasonably upset every single time when it did not come out the way that he was expecting. And I would tell him all the time, Dad, you just have to beat them I can show you. And he's like, no, I gotta get this right in my head. And he just couldn't. He could never get there. I think this is where he needs to go to maybe find some rehabilitation.
So, okay, do you mind clarifying? Did he break the egg yolks?
Yeah. So,
because I'm imagining like the horror story of someone like making these weird fried eggs that are entirely lace.
Yeah, so he would basically have two bowls, right? He would crack the egg open, he'd separate the egg whites into one bowl, and then he'd drop the egg yolks in the other. He'd do this for however many eggs he was making. And then he would beat the egg yolks together, and then he would attempt to beat the egg whites in the separate bowl into something with a structure, and just never had the dedication to get there.
That's rough.
I mean, it does literally sound like some form of penance.
Yeah,
It really does. Yeah.
and it's again, it comes down to that like refusal to accept help. Like,
Right.
I think that's the kind of breaking point for someone having to go to this indefinite culinary penance. I have, just to tell a quick story. I worked with a girl when I worked at the record store here in town, who would constantly complain about the coffee in the coffee machine. We had a little like Mr. Coffee kind of thing, and every time she opened the store, she would complain about how the coffee was really weak. It doesn't taste good. There's no flavor. Blah blah blah. So finally, one of the quote unquote corporate people who like worked at the main office came in, and I walked into the store. She's like almost in tears, and I was like, "What's up?" She's like, "The coffee that I can't remember her name now that she keeps complaining about." I'm like, "Yeah." She's been putting whole coffee beans in the machine and just running hot water over it.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. Routinely. Like, this happened at least for 2 or 3 weeks.
Look, in the interest of combating Cody's mind virus, you can learn how to cook. You can. It's
Mhm.
possible. You can get better. You can figure out how to grind coffee. These things are all within your fingertips.
There are so many tools out there now.
You
There are
don't
several
So many.
you don't
several
need
shows on
penance.
Food Network that help you for this.
Yeah.
Exactly. You don't need to
You
go
don't-
through penance.
I should rephrase what I said earlier. Like, you don't have to become like a high-end Gordon Ramsay kind of thing. You can just be good at cooking at home. And there's so many cool tools out there to be better at it. And cooking is fun.
Yeah, perhaps that's just something I missed out on living in the Midwest my whole life.
Could be, yeah. Come to South Texas and get your vegetables in blocks.
Oh yeah, big fan. I'll trade you for a bag of milk. We have that up here.
We have that down here too.
Nice. I don't know who
Thankfully,
came up with that
our milk
concept.
is not in bags here. I'm safe from the monstrosity.
It's an experience, man.
It's cheaper.
Yeah.
You're acting like it's powdered milk, Will. It's not powdered milk, it's just milk in a bag.
It's just the bag of
Liquids
milk, dude.
should be in containers, and
It is in a
containers
container.
should not
Yeah.
conform to the shape of the liquid.
You buy a container to put the bag in too.
Yeah.
It's sitting in the fake container
It's like
for
a
too long. It's absorbing.
it's the hard part, because we had them in elementary school. The hard part was putting the straw in them. You had to like hold it down like it was some kind of a beast that you were trying to stab to death. And then you would just try to hope you got the angle right and you weren't pushing too hard. Oh man, it was a real science.
Yeah, I think Will's in the wrong on this one.
And have either of you had a spinach casserole with cheese in it? Because I haven't, and that doesn't sound good.
I can't say
have.
that I have.
Okay, that's nice.
Good for you.
I'm glad. I'm serious. I'm glad that it's nice. I
I've-
was worried.
I've had it two different ways. One where it was like shredded cheese from a bag that was mixed in with all of the other ingredients, and then one where the cheese was sprinkled over the top and then it was like put underneath a broiler so the cheese later melted on the top. Yeah, I've had it prepared both ways.
It doesn't sound bad.
It's not. At least I don't remember tasting it and being like, oh, take that shit home. Like, I don't remember having a visceral reaction.
We can probably trust your memory then if you don't remember vomiting immediately.
Mm-hmm. No, I've only ever done that once, and it was on my babysitter's table when she invited my family over for dinner.
It's always at the most opportune time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thus began my long my long injurious list of "Am I allergic to mushrooms?" that has lasted me
Ooh.
through my entire life. I have no idea if I am or not.
Go
That's
get
not a
tested.
fun one.
That's not.
Yeah.
Don't want to find out the hard way. That's for sure.
What would the hard way be?
Dying?
Anaphylaxis.
Oh, sure.
How we
Yeah,
found out my son is allergic to nuts.
that's fair.